Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first day of hearings of the Mayor's proposed budget for fiscal year 2013-2014. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Budget and Finance Committee, and I'm joined by a full contingent of the committee, the Honourable Bill Rosendahl and Council members Mitchell Englander, Paul Kretz, and Tom Labange are all joining me today. Today is April 30th, 2013, and we're going to be proceeding today and each day following today until we have completed consideration of this budget. We'll start off the day today with a presentation by the Mayor's budget team and the CAO, and then we'll be hearing particular issues with regard to the budgets, if time permitting, of the City Controller's Office, the City Attorney's Office, the Office of Finance and Treasurer, as well as the Lacers Pensions Department. But before we begin with the presentations, I do just want to let me do this first. I want to welcome everyone to this hearing, all of the members of the committee. We're back again for my second year as chair, and as we begin this project of careful review of the Mayor's budget, I'd like to give each of the members an opportunity to provide any introductory comments that they'd like to provide before we start, if there are any. And seeing none, all right, well, we'll go right ahead then to a brief discussion about how this will play out. As in past years, we'll be hearing from each of the general managers who will come here and respond to the committee's questions regarding their budget, and we'll have an opportunity for dialogue. What has typically happened in the past is each general manager is asked to provide additional information that may not be readily available while they're here during hearings. And so this committee has asked for a series of reports back, which are heard in committee before we report out to Council. Frequently, those reports have involved matters that don't directly impact the current consideration of the next fiscal year's budget. And so we're going to start to draw a distinction between those two different kinds of reports. Those that require an immediate report back to this committee in order to make an informed decision about this budget, and those that can wait, or typically that involve larger policy questions, those that can wait until following the budget hearings. And that process will allow our staff, frankly, more time to be able to focus their attention on where it's needed most, and that is the specific consideration of the budget. So if members want to have questions answered regarding something specific to their district, or a larger policy question that isn't necessarily a budget-related thing, we'll certainly have the opportunity to explore all of those issues, but the reports back on them will not be coming during this next 2 weeks or so of budget hearings. They will come following that. And so the way we're going to do that, the CAO and CLA will collaborate on the development of a list of those report back memos, and after each day of hearings, committee staff will review the list and isolate those memos that they believe pertain specifically to the next fiscal year's budget. Any requests for information that don't specifically pertain to the budget will also be compiled and considered as a package during the final budget vote in Council, and then referred back to this committee and or respective policy committees as the case may be. So starting tomorrow, and then on each subsequent day of hearings as we move forward, the bifurcated list of memos, those that involve the budget specifically and those that don't as directly, will be the first item up for consideration by this committee, and we will then have an opportunity to agree or disagree with staff's recommendation regarding what should be, if you will, on the A list of reports back that are going to be considered during budget considerations. Does that make sense to members? Any questions about that procedure? All right. So with that, I think we should be ready to begin, and I'd like to invite the Mayor's office to present the proposed budget, and we shall begin. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Krikorian and Council Budget and Finance Committee members. I am Monique Earle, Deputy Mayor of Budget and Financial Policy. This afternoon, I am pleased to provide you with an overview of the proposed City of Los Angeles budget for fiscal year 2013-2014 as presented by Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. I would like to begin by offering my sincerest thanks to everyone involved in the development of this important document. In addition, I would like to acknowledge the outstanding performance of my dedicated budget team, CAO's office, and the General Services Department print shop for their efforts to ensure the accurate and on-time completion of this, the Mayor's 8th and final proposed City of Los Angeles budget. The proposed budget that you have before you today has been developed collaboratively under the leadership of the Mayor's office with the CAO, city department managers, neighborhood councils, and Los Angeles City residents who have provided invaluable feedback and suggestions via the Mayor's Budget Survey. Committee members, I would assert, in one sense, this document is a $7.7 billion balanced spending plan that builds upon the success of bold fiscal measures enacted by the Mayor and Council to secure the city's long-term financial health. In another sense, it is a renewed commitment to the residents of Los Angeles to adequately fund core city services, to preserve unparalleled gains in crime reduction, to make meaningful investments in our city's youth, to restore the capacity of our city's emergency response services, to reinvest in our infrastructure, and to build a stable foundation for sustainable economic recovery and growth in our city. That is why today I am pleased to report that after several years of stagnant revenue growth, the City of Los Angeles can bear witness to authentic signs of economic recovery. The CAO projects that the city's general fund will realize a 5.6% increase in revenue growth this year, and an additional 5.1% growth is projected for the upcoming fiscal year. These revenue increases are due to calculable growth in key, sensitive economic revenue sources, including city property tax, sales tax, documentary transfer tax, and transit occupancy tax. The growth in the city's economically sensitive revenues, coupled with the expenditure reductions implemented over the past few years, have provided an opportunity to begin to reinvest in city services. This budget also proposes new efficiencies and lays the groundwork for a more streamlined approach toward economic development. This includes the creation of a new economic development department tasked with a focus on small business support, workforce development, and job creation, and the implementation of a centralized city planning and development department, representing a significant consolidation of various development services into one city agency. While the economy is showing positive signs of recovery, which do allow us to begin restoring some critical services, it remains ever more apparent that we continue to directly address the city's major cost drivers: employee salary and healthcare cost. As such, the Mayor's proposed fiscal plan also includes tough choices. Most significantly, the proposed budget does not provide funding for previously negotiated 5.5% pay raises set to go in effect next fiscal year on January 1st. Furthermore, The proposed budget reduces funding for civilian health benefits in an amount equivalent to a 10% employee health premium contribution. By renegotiating these employee benefits, the mayor believes that the next administration would be afforded the opportunity to ensure the city's long-term financial health. The mayor acknowledges how difficult these actions will be to implement. In order to provide a stable and strong fiscal foundation, the budget proposes a $255 million reserve fund totaling more than 5% of the entire general fund. In addition, the budget sets aside $16 million in cash reserves for budget stabilization and $21 million in reserves for economic uncertainties. This will undoubtedly help to secure the city against unforeseen fluctuations in our operations and the economy. In summary, the proposed budget maintains the city's commitment to deliver effective public safety, continues to address our major cost drivers, builds strong cash reserves, and uses savings to restore and reinvest in critical services for the benefit of Los Angeles residents and visitors. On behalf of Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, I would like to thank both the City Council and the members and staff of the Council Budget and Finance Committee for their tireless work to develop and sustain the City of Los Angeles' enduring fiscal well-being for Angelenos now and for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think certainly we can all take a significant measure of pride in the progress that has been made over the course of the last very, very difficult 4 to 5 years since the economic collapse of 2008. It was just a short time ago when this fiscal year that we're looking at in this budget was projected to have a deficit of over $1 billion, and the vast majority of that deficit has been erased. But it's clear that we still have significant ways to go before we have righted the ship completely, and that's looking forward to continuing on that path together. I should have said at the outset a few things about public comment. If you'd like to provide comment about the budget or any other matter, frankly, within the jurisdiction of this committee, please fill out one of these cards and bring it forward, and we'll take today, we will take general public comment following the CAO's presentation, and then I will also, if we do have cards that are specific to particular departments, we'll also offer an opportunity to comment at that time, at the time we take up those departments, for 1 minute each. So right now I only have 2 cards, but if you'd like to be heard, please fill out a card and bring it forward. And now we will go to an overview of the budget and comments by our City Administrative Officer, Miguel Santana. Mr. Santana.
Good afternoon, and thank all of you. I'd also like to join in thanking the entire CAO staff in the preparation of this budget. Many worked tireless nights, and as well as thanking the mayor and his team who were effective partners in putting together a responsible budget for next year that builds on the progress that's been made so far, and if fully implemented will result in the city no longer experiencing cycles of deficit by 2017. So at CAO, if we could turn to the first slide, at CAO there are 2 times that we worry. We worry during times of dramatic drops in revenue, which we saw in 2009-10. And then we also worry in dramatic increases in revenue, which we're experiencing now. The reason we worry during times of increases, because how we manage those increases impact how we proceed in the future. What this budget does, it responsibly handles the increases of ongoing revenue by being responsible in its forecasting of the economically sensitive revenues, and it also invests one-time revenue heavily on one-time items. As a result of the actions that the mayor has proposed, this is the first time in the last several years that this budget does not ask all of you to declare a fiscal emergency. There are no furloughs in this budget, and if the budget is fully implemented, there is no layoffs. The budget also assumes, has in it, the 70-30 recommendation that we issued in terms of solving the $216 million deficit. About 68% of the solutions presented in this budget are in fact ongoing revenues or ongoing solutions, and the remaining are one-time. This budget assumes, as Monique stated, an assumption that we will continue to partner with labor to address our compensation costs as well as our healthcare costs. These two pieces are important and a critical part of reaching a point of zero deficit in the next few years. Should we not be successful in achieving these outcomes, what we will continue to face are a series of deficits in the future. This budget responsibly restores priorities established by the mayor and consistent with goals of your council without relying on deficit borrowing or with speculative revenue. And this budget also, for the first time, actually fully funds the CIEP. This is our program to ensure that we invest in our infrastructure, putting aside 1% of the general fund. And it does so in a variety of capacities. And finally, this budget is consistent with the guiding principles that your council has approved 3 years ago to finally bring the city to fiscal sustainability. So for the viewers watching this, you know, we get often asked, well, what includes the City of Los Angeles budget? And if you look at any department or any function that actually carries the city seal on it, then the total amount of the city budget as city government as a whole is $21.3 billion, representing about 46,000 employees. When you remove the proprietary departments, that it's about approximately $12 billion, then we focus exclusively on the general city budget, which includes both the general funds and the special funds, a total of $7.6 billion, and an additional $1.2 billion from special grants. Now, drilling down on the city budget, this budget assumes an increase in general fund revenue of 7.1% budget to budget, and an increase of special fund revenue of 4.5% budget to budget. But you notice that the workforce is staying constant. There's very little growth in the size of the workforce, in part due to the fact that our compensation, healthcare costs, workers' comp, and pension costs continue to grow, giving us little flexibility to add additional positions as a whole. In terms of the growth in revenue, 45% of that growth is one time. That means that we cannot expect that revenue the following year. That one-time revenue is made up of a number of different sources, including going through various transportation grants and getting reimbursing the general fund. The AB 678 revenue for ambulance billing that was assumed for this year, but will likely be arrive the following year. An additional $13.6 million of SPRF one time beyond the $21.5 million of ongoing. The property tax administration fees due to a settlement we're reaching with the county of $6 million. Telecommunication development account of $5.2. The business tax amnesty program, $5.5. Police time reimbursements of $1 million. Parking users tax, $400,000 due to improved collections, and the budget stabilization fund transfer of $53 million. Now, in terms of ongoing revenues, it's important to point out that, as Monique stated, we're actually seeing a significant growth in our ongoing, most economically sensitive revenues. Those include utility tax, business tax, sales tax, hotel tax, documentary transfer tax, and parking. Overall, we're experiencing a 7% growth in those revenues, and as we forecast in the future, we're assuming that the growth will continue at a pace consistent with what we've learned from various economists. You know, the further out you project, the harder it is to be accurate. But certainly this office takes pride in the fact that from year to year, our ability to estimate our revenues are fairly close. Now, this next slide shows us a reason to be concerned. So this is what the pattern has been for the documentary transfer tax since 1969. And of course, if you look at 2005-06, the documentary transfer tax reached close to $220 million. And then we all experienced the dramatic drop down to about $75 million in a very short period of time. It was part of what we had to deal with in 2009-10. This tax, while certainly is beneficial to the city, is incredibly volatile and sensitive to the economy. And so we could see how dramatically it has increased just in this last 6 months alone. And so in some ways, this tax the D really stands for dangerous tax. If you budget at the highest level, and you assume spending at that level, we will certainly likely face deficits in the future. So part of our overall solution to reaching long-term fiscal health for the city is ensuring that we adopt a budget stabilization fund that takes into account these dramatic growths in taxes like the documentary transfer tax and declines. Now, so you've all seen this pie chart before. It talks about, as the chairman indicated, that it wasn't that long ago we projected a $2 billion deficit on July 1st of 2013. That deficit has now been reduced to 216. So this budget solves that deficit and actually invests one-time revenue into one-time programs. So the first is this summarizes, breaks up the one-time with the ongoing. There's approximately $111 million of ongoing revenue, ongoing solutions rather, as well as due to the $51 million that the city is able to generate as a result of the pension savings that we've achieved due to the various pension reform efforts that your council has adopted. There's $14.9 million of efficiencies, $13 million of funding realignments, and an additional $45 million of spending. So again, 68% of the solutions are ongoing. Of the one-time, it's about $140 million, of which representing 32% of the overall solutions. So what does this budget represent in the future? And this is a chart that we share with bond rating agencies, with investors, and with the public as we project out what our future looks like. Again, our revenue assumption continues to be that revenue will continue to grow at approximately close to 3% each year. A growth pattern consistent with what many economists have advised us. It also assumes that the COLAs that are being adopted, that have been approved through contract, get in fact renegotiated. Most city employees will experience a 1.75% increase on July 1st and an additional 5.5% step increase on January 1st. And it is our hope that we could partner with labor and identify ways to mitigate the cost of those increases over the next several months. If we're successful, it provides a long-term solution to our overall fiscal challenges. And as I indicated, by the year 2017, gets us to actually experiencing an ongoing surplus. This projection also assumes that we maintain overtime levels at a more responsible way than what we had just a few years ago, when overtime in the police department exceeded $100 million. And so we're, with those two elements, plus the reducing the subsidy towards health care from, instead of being 100% of the Kaiser family rate to 90%, we will achieve a structural surplus by 2017. Now, I've often been asked, so what happens if we're not successful? If we're not successful in reaching an agreement with the coalition of unions, and if we're not successful in maintaining our overtime cost to approximately $20 million a year. And in the event that we're not successful, our projected deficit grows to $267 million instead of the $159 we project for next year. And the surplus that we hope to achieve by fiscal year 17 of $15 million becomes a deficit of $93 million. It is the overtime, the COLAs, and the health care are the three factors that result in a change from the first chart to the second chart. Everything else, including revenue projections and the size of the workforce, stay constant. So, going back to the budget is consistent and applies the 5 main points established in presented to your council 3 years ago, and that include responsible fiscal management, a focus on core services, identifying alternative service delivery models, maintaining a sustainable workforce, and being responsible in the management of our revenue. On responsible fiscal management, this budget has, for the first time, a reserve fund of 5.24, a goal that has been in place for many years and only achieved over a decade ago. It also establishes a stronger budget stabilization fund, previously funded at only $500,000 and actually is set at about $16 million. It engages in smart investments by providing $52 million of general fund for the capital improvement program, again, a much needed part of our overall budgeting. It provides $15 million to deal with the increasing overtime bank, which we'll talk about shortly. And it provides for the full implementation of the fire automatic vehicle locator, fuel management system, and computer-aided dispatch system. In finance, a treasury management system. In ITA, a customer relations or CRM system, and disaster recovery for financial systems. And in GSD, emergency generator equipment support, FMS interface support, and vehicle management system. These are not sexy items. They're not going to generate headlines, but they're part of maintaining a government that has to exist during good times and bad and require investments. To the reserve fund, again, this shows how we've been able to slowly increase the reserve fund in a responsible way over the last few years. And there certainly has been, as we experienced last year, a strong discussion as to the need of having a reserve fund be 5%. And it is a strong position for the city to be in to exceed it at 5.24. Now, this chart is something that we should continue to talk about in the future as we look at the police department, not just for next year, but in outgoing years. The purple chart really shows how much, actually the red chart line shows how much the use of overtime has dropped under the leadership of Chief Beck. It went from 1.9 million hours to 1.1 million hours. The tool that the chief has utilized to reduce overtime so dramatically has been to, instead of paying our police officers in cash, is giving them that time through actual time, and that time gets banked. The results of that has been that over the last few years, the overtime bank has dramatically increased. The bank value today is $109 million, and the number of hours is about 2.2 million. And so as we look forward in the future, particularly at the expiration of our contract with PPL, where the number of banked hours gets reduced to 150 hours, the same amount it was just a few years ago when we were spending over $100 million in police overtime. We have an opportunity over the next year to engage in a much more strategic approach in managing this issue. The police department will continue to rely on overtime to address crime as it occurs and to ensure the timely investigation of cases. At the same time, the city can't afford to go back to the way things used to be. So we have 1 year to try to figure out a more combined, blended approach in addressing this overall problem. In terms of core services, this budget significantly increases the general fund contribution towards street services. Most people will be shocked to learn that the budget we're currently in has $1 million of general fund to repave our streets. The far majority of the revenue currently being utilized for the repayment program come from state and federal sources of funding. Unfortunately, those sources are on the decline, and the prospect of getting any relief is very, very small. And so what this budget does is, for the first time in many, many years, actually makes a contribution of general fund dollars to make up that difference and increases the number of miles to 800. Now, in the forecast, we assume that that number goes down to the bare minimum based on what the department recommends of 735. But while the various outside sources that support that funding decline, it assumes that the general fund is making up that difference up until a new ongoing source is identified. It provides funding for tree trimming of 3.5 and graffiti removal of 1 million. It upgrades 25 fire companies and basic life support to advanced life at 1.5. It provides funding for the police fleet replacement program of 15 million. Restores 7-day service at the library of 1 million, maintains funding for homeless services and meals for seniors at 11 million, and presents, as Monique stated, a more effective approach in dealing with development as well as economic development. In addition to this budget also assumes that we will be successful in identifying a private operator to run the convention center. At the time that private operator is identified, we would then propose changes to the budget based on the pricing that we receive. But it also assumes that there's a contribution made to start up the new economic development nonprofit. This is a critical component in helping Los Angeles grow jobs and revenue. And as the CLA and I have recommended, it is an essential piece to our overall recovery. And it also assumes that we engage in a partnership with GLAZA to enhance marketing at the LA Zoo so that we could bring in additional revenue. In terms of our workforce sustainability, this budget limits staff growth to only 0.2%. With 83% of the growth being limited to the library, fire, and animal services, as approved by your council recently. It also assumes the full implementation of Tier 2, which is our new civilian tier effective July 1st, 2013, and assumes savings from that new tier. It assumes that there will be no furloughs and hopefully no layoffs. And it also assumes that the subsidy towards health care, instead of being 100% towards the full cost of the Kaiser family rate, is at 90%. And then as we move out in the outer years, it assumes that the city does not provide any future increases. This chart you've seen before, it shows how we're going to have to maintain the workforce at the current levels. Throughout these budget hearings, you will hear from many of my colleagues in different departments who will raise concern about their staffing levels. And there isn't one single department head that will come up here that's going to raise a concern that's not legitimate. All city departments have been dramatically impacted due to the recession that we've experienced and to the fiscal crisis. The unfortunate thing is that with the loss of Measure A, this is now our new normal. This is the size of the workforce that we should assume for the next few years, and it's the size of the workforce that we're anticipating to be able to reach a zero deficit by the year 2017. There'll be little flexibility left to dramatically increase the size of the workforce, certainly at the levels that we saw back in 2007-8. The next chart shows how we're starting to see the benefits of the pension reform that you've adopted. It wasn't too long ago that we projected for fiscal year 16-17, as an example, that we would have to contribute $1.2 billion in contributions, and now those projections, based on the latest illustrations provided by our two systems, are down to $1.1 billion. The good news is that the growth is slowing down. The bad news is that the growth continues. So the pace of the growth has been maintained. And this is something that your council should be very proud of, because when I look at our counterparts around the country, few could illustrate that their pension costs are being maintained in the same way. Now, this next chart shows why the discussion around compensation is important. We all recently saw the press coverage around the request made by labor to the County of Los Angeles for future increases. And if you look at the bottom line in the purple, they've had several consecutive years with no raises. So we went back to compare ourselves to the county since the year 2001-2, and overall the county experienced pay increases to their comparable positions here at the city of about approximately 20%. The red line represents the increases committed to the coalition of unions, and the blue line represents those commitments already made to sworn at 35.25%, and the green line represents EAA and a number of other small bargaining units. The challenge for the city is, in order to be able to maintain and move forward to a zero deficit by 2017, not only must we reduce the red line, but we must also maintain the green and blue lines for the next 4 years to mirror similar work that was done in the county. Any future raises that are granted will only increase the projected deficits in the future. In terms of overall health and welfare benefits, the red line represents how much the city provides in subsidy per person on an annual basis for our fire personnel at $14,035. The blue line represents how much is granted our police at $13,000, and the green line represents the total amount that we provide for our civilian workforce. The most dramatic difference is, of course, that in 2002-3, that subsidy was at $5,000 per person. Now it's at $11,000 per person. Now, this is consistent with what we see around the country. This is not unique to the city of Los Angeles, and in many ways the city has done significant work to address these costs. The first thing that we're doing is that we're actually engaging in a competitive process to identify who our provider is. And that process is done in collaboration with labor through our Joint Labor Management Committee, and we'll begin that work now. The second thing is that any surpluses that we experience, we commit to take care of that increased cost. But should there not be enough revenue through that surplus, then we're going to have to find other ways to be able to control these costs in the future. The next chart shows what it means in aggregate in terms of actual dollars being provided for health benefits for our employees at $221 million for our civilian, at $129 for police, and $46 million for fire, all increasing dramatically since 2002-03. In terms of revenue, this budget identifies $322 million of new general fund revenues compared to the current year budget. And again, 177 is ongoing and 145 is one-time. And it effectively uses the one-time revenue to build on our infrastructure, which is a critical component of our budgeting. But we still have some challenges in the future. We continue to have a persistent unemployment rate that hovers at about 10%. Our real estate growth is being generated by low interest rates and the low inventory, and that clearly could change in the future, and it's beyond our control. We still don't know the full impact of the federal sequestration to the economy and to the city. And then we are, of course, part of a larger global economy, and certainly any kind of economic challenges that are confronted in Europe or in Asia impact the city as well. So finally, as you move forward with your deliberations, we're recommending a series of sort of principles that you maintain, consistent with the difficult work that you've done over the last few years. The first is that at the end of this process, our hope is that your budget will continue to maintain as close to the 70-30 ratio, 70-30 of ongoing solutions and 30% of one-time solutions. Any deviation from that only impacts the outer year deficits. We also strongly recommend that you maintain the 5% reserve fund and that you continue to build the budget stabilization fund. On a separate letter, the CLA and I submitted a report to all of you on a budget stabilization fund policy that, if applied, will help us in the future deal with dramatic increases in revenue and dramatic declines. It's a way of ensuring some level of stability out in the future, as well as helping us deal with unforeseen challenges that we encounter, including a number of major liabilities we have hovering above us, including the Ardón case and others. If we also strongly ask that if you make any additions to ongoing expenditures, that you find the equivalent of reductions to ensure that future out-year deficits aren't increased. That's going to be particularly challenging as you hear many departments talk about the specific concerns they have about the level of funding their budgets are at and the minimal staffing that they're confronted. We also recommend that you maintain strong but reasonable revenue projections, and that we not engage in deficit borrowing. You know, we're one of the few major cities that have actually survived the last 4 years without having to pull out a credit card to deal with our ongoing deficits. We've confronted them head on, and it's something to be proud of, and we hope that that will continue. We also ask that services should only be restored or enhanced through ongoing sources of funds, and if they're not, should services be restored or enhanced, support services must also be accounted for. You know, there's often a conversation about how do you restore services in public safety and fire in particular. Well, fire doesn't operate in isolation. There are a number of support departments that often assist that, so you have to consider the whole picture, not just the picture of the department, as well as the related costs associated with any restoration of positions. And then we also have begun, at the direction of ERC, to reach out to labor to try to reach a consensus as it relates to the various concessions. With that, we'll be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Santana, for that presentation. I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, I'd like to ask both the CAO and the Mayor's office to respond to how we arrived at, what the thinking process was in reinvesting in some of the things that you described to Mr. Santana as being smart investments and reflecting the mayor's priorities, when we still are in the midst of a recession that we're recovering from, but we still are in the midst of a recession. We have a number of assumptions in this budget that one significant one needs to be negotiated with labor, and so it is not guaranteed to be realized. We have a $52 million projected increase in the documentary transfer tax, which you, I think, aptly described as the dangerous tax, because it is the single most volatile revenue source that we have, a revenue source that declined by more than 50% over a 2-year span after 2008. So given those factors, and given the fact that we still have not addressed our ongoing structural deficit over the next several years, is this the time to be adding any services? And what was the reasoning in trying to add new services, add new expenditures at a time when we're also choosing to assume a reduction, for example, in our employees' salaries and assume an increased contribution to health and welfare?
I could start off with the approach, and certainly the mayor's budget deputy could talk about the specific priorities. So you heard me say in this context, and certainly I made this argument to the mayor personally, is that the first task was to solve the deficit of 216 with 2/3 ongoing solutions and 1/3 one-time as a bare minimum. And so that was achieved. That was achieved through the increases in revenues that are projected, that are consistent with what we're seeing both at the county and other local governments, and consistent with what we were advised by various economists. It's also achieved through savings through our pension system and maintaining our workforce at current levels, and in some cases actually eliminating some vacant positions. So once that was achieved, then those ongoing solutions were put aside, and then you started identifying what the one-time revenue was. Unfortunately, there wasn't 100% ongoing solutions to deal with the entire deficit. The revenues didn't grow that high, and the solutions would have been much more painful to have ongoing solutions. So an example of that would be street services. Street services is facing its own structural deficit. It's been propped up first by federal stimulus dollars, and then by Measure R, as well as state revenue sources. Those the first to go was the stimulus dollars, and all of the various state revenue sources are on the decline. And so there's a decision to be made as to whether or not you reduce the overall repaving of our streets to the amount that we could afford, or you pursue other options. Given the increase in one-time revenue, I think the mayor smartly chose to invest one-time dollars of general fund to keep the program at 800 miles, and then in the future we assume it to go down to 735 miles. That was an investment in part because I think few people would argue that our streets are not our core services. The second investments were made in areas where either we have a liability, such as our overtime liability. It was to reduce the amount that we currently see at over $100 million. Under this program, no officer will have more than 375 hours banked. We have to pay that one way or the other. So normally we pay it when someone retires, and we pay it at a much higher rate. So we pay it at the rate, not at their current salary, but the salary they retire in. So we know for a fact that overtime bank is going to grow, regardless of whether the chief uses it more. It just grows automatically due to raises that are given and various promotions. So that was a smart investment in dealing with the liability. The second investments were in relation to other challenges, particularly on our sidewalks. And then we would also argue the investment to trim our trees is a way of reducing future liability in the future. So in the context of the approach, unfortunately, there still wasn't enough ongoing solutions to deal with 100% of the problem. But we got closer to that than ever before in the last 4 years. Almost 70% are in fact ongoing, with only a minor part being done. Now, being able to do that came as a result of your council being firm on establishing a budget stabilization fund this year. You had the option that as revenues came in to spend those dollars today. And you chose instead to allow those revenues to stay in the budget stabilization fund so then you could help deal with next year's deficit, which was part of the way you got to that solution.
And council members, as you know, our communities, and particularly your respective districts, have seen mounting increases in infrastructure challenges due to the fiscal constraints that we've had to endure over the last several fiscal years. And it really was a decision by the mayor to take a look at the one-time dollars that were above and beyond what we used to solve the budget deficit to reinvest in our infrastructure, in our core services where the maintenance had been deferred over the last several years. So we really wanted to maintain the council's policy and the city's policy of using one-time resources for one-time expenditures, and the mayor chose to do that throughout a variety of categories in our streets, in our sidewalks, in our police department needs, vehicles, technology, things of that nature, but to definitely use those dollars to secure those things.
So specifically with regard to the budget stabilization fund, which was accumulated with great pain, sacrifice that our employees have made, reductions that our departments have made in order to be able to fund the budget stabilization fund even in very lean times. It's akin to a family having trouble paying their month-to-month bills and yet still forcing themselves to deposit money into that savings account for an even rainier day in the future. This budget proposes to empty that bank account of 3/4 of what has been put into it, when we know that we are facing projected deficits at least for 3 or 4 more years to come. Is that a wise approach? And isn't it the CAO's proposal or recommendation to adopt a policy that no more than 25% of the budget stabilization fund should be tapped in any given year for deficit reduction?
And that is our recommendation. That is your council hopefully will hear that and adopt that recommendation in the near future, and that policy should guide us, particularly in the projected growth and revenue that you see forecasted in what's before you. But I think it's important to also state that our infrastructure doesn't just go away. You know, the policy, the decisions as to where to invest were clearly those of the mayor. But this office continues to stand firm with the insistence that we not ignore our infrastructure. In the long term, it costs us more to simply put it off year after year and deal with it when it hits a point of a crisis. And so the second area, again, is to address areas where you know you have a liability. The overtime is clearly a liability that has an interest rate at the same rate as any future COLAs that are granted. And we know we have a series of COLAs still projected for next year in our swarm personnel. And so we could choose to ignore that and allow it to grow and then just leave it for another somebody else to deal with later. But the fact is that it not only impacts our future budgeting, but it also impacts the level of services that are provided out in the community. Every time we ask the chief to control his overtime costs, we're basically telling him to take officers off the street. And so there's a direct correlation between that bank and the department's capacity in maintaining public safety in our community. So these investments were in fact smart from the standpoint that they address specific liabilities and are consistent with policies that your council has already approved, including the 1% towards infrastructure.
And if I may, don't get me wrong, I don't question for a moment that any of these recommendations are smart investments. The question is, should we be spending 3/4 of the budget stabilization savings that we've realized this year to achieve those ends, meaning that in subsequent years, in year 1, out year 2, out year 3, when we still are facing budget deficits, we still will have infrastructure needs, we'll still have banked overtime that we have to deal with, we won't have that source of funding to be able to address it then. So in a sense, yes, we're using that money now to relieve some of the pain. That means we'll have proportionally less funds in the out years to be able to address the exact same issues which we know we're going to continue to have. And my point with this, I suppose, is not so much to get a specific answer on that point, but to remind us that this is not a one-year issue with a one-year solution. It is a multi-year problem that we have, and if we use all of our ammunition to deal with the first year deficit, we're not going to have that same ammunition left in year 2 and year 3 and year 4, and that's my concern with regard to that. So I hope that we'll have an opportunity for more of a discussion of how we are going to replenish that budget stabilization fund, what kind of policy we're going to adopt in future years to be able to use that as a vehicle to mitigate the ups and downs that come when we have a city that is dependent on such a volatile revenue base.
And Councilmember, I'd like to thank you for making that point, but also ask the committee to recognize that our reserve fund is funded now at over 5%, in which the policy is currently at 5% of general fund. And then we also have a reserve for economic uncertainty on top of a $16 million budget stabilization fund. So we do have a variety of contingencies in this particular budget that can help us to secure against the future deficits.
Sure, although we certainly don't want to be in a position where we're making backward progress on our reserve, which we've worked very hard to get over the 5, which we've worked very hard to actually even meet the city's own basic financial policies, which has meant a great deal in our ability to market our bonds, for example, throughout the country. Mr. Rosendahl.
Santana, you mentioned Tiger funds, which I'm thrilled about, obviously. The President announced it a couple of days ago that he was going to provide those funds, which can be worked by us if we get a significant amount by street services to be spent in doing some of this work. What's your understanding of the Tiger money? How much are we talking about Tiger funds? And can it be used by street services now for issues that we have?
Well, I think the President announced that in the context of his budget, and
That's
obviously
right.
It still has to go through the legislative process, and concurrent to the announcement of his budget, we're also seeing the impacts of the sequestration cuts, not just in transportation, but across the board. So I would caution your council to look towards the federal government for any specific enhanced funding for our sidewalks and streets in particular. I think our challenge is going to be to protect the funding we have now for some of our major transportation projects that are being supported through LA Metro, as well as some that are supported by the city. So
won't the Tiger funds go to that kind of stuff? Isn't that what?
Yeah. So I think that it is, and certainly the state is barely managing its own financial picture. Fortunately for them, Prop 30 did pass, and so they were provided a level of relief, and they're also seeing, in the same way as we are, an increase in revenues that are sensitive to the economy. But I would be, my hope is that they simply leave us alone. I think it would be a bonus if we actually get additional funding from the state. I wouldn't certainly count on it as a way of addressing our shortfalls in street services. You know, for a city our size, the second largest city in the country, with more roads to be responsible for, it is frankly shocking that our general fund contribution this year is $1 million. There's a lot of smaller cities in the San Gabriel Valley and in southeast Los Angeles that contribute that amount, if not more. And let's be clear that, you know, the proposal being spearheaded by council members Buscaino and Englander address those streets that we've basically given up on, the streets that we don't have any funding to address at all, the streets that have failed. The revenue that's being projected in this budget deals with those streets that we're at least repaving at a minimal level. And regardless of whether or not that measure is successful, what the city needs is both the bonding that is being proposed by council members Englander and Buscaino, as well as a continued funding for the repaving program.
Yeah, well, I hope that our congressional leadership shows some leadership on this with the president, because those Tiger funds are bread and potatoes for us in doing these kinds of services, and I think the president is working on that. But we need to get a hold of an Adam Schiff or a Janice Hahn or one of our friends in there to find out what time frame we might be talking about, and if there's anything else we need to do, because this is potential real money that can really help us. As for bond measures, you know, I was chair of Public Works. Very first thing I wanted to do was bonds, and that went on and off and off and on and this and that, and never went anywhere for all kinds of reasons. And so the idea, though, of those services is as critical as us sitting here today. So if we can get somebody to give us some sensing, if it's real money, what time frame we'd be talking about, and could it impact us now? If it can, great. If it can't, great. I just need to know the facts.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Mr. Englander.
Yeah, I just wanted to, before I weighed in, listen to both sort of the opening questions and as well as the remarks from the CAO and the mayor's office, and take a step back and say, first of all, I want to compliment the mayor and his team on this budget. It's one of the most transparent budgets we've seen, quite frankly, walking out of this. There's no fuzzy math. There's no future borrow of obligations from perhaps like what was proposed in the past to put off a payment of pensions for another year. There are issues of concern, certainly, that I share with Mr. Krikorian, with our chair, that he brought up. But I think we've got to step back and look at this for what it is as well. I mean, I don't think you would ever present a budget that we would all jump in on head first and say, okay, this is fantastic, and we don't have to do a thing. Let's stop all the budget deliberations and pass this thing immediately. There's certainly some questions, there's some concerns, there's some ideas, there's some thoughts, and we'll go through that deliberative process. And I echo the chairman's concerns. The biggest ones in the room are the stabilization fund, and we'll have to dive into that, because I agree with the CAO and the 25% maximum rate, if you will, or transfer, or however we want to label that. But there's some very good things in here as well. And there's been a lot of work. This is, again, the first budget that we're looking at now without furloughs, without layoffs, with maintaining some of the core services, with increasing, again, some of those critical core functions, restoration of some of the fire services, the pay down of the sworn overtime, at least at some capacity. We'll have more discussion on that as we go through the process. The addition in at least those minimum level of street maintenance efforts and tree trimming, and not a huge borrow to do that from Measure R. I mean, there's a lot of compliments that could be said, quite frankly, and I think they should be, as we start off and leap off into the next several days and weeks ahead, going through department by department. But our CLA and our CAO and the mayor's office have really worked really hard with, you know, given what we've had to deal with over the last several years. The fact that we've got an over 5% reserve now is phenomenal. There is a lot of fighting just to get to that point. and it wasn't without the leadership, and I say the leadership pushing the council members, because it was truly the leadership of this committee pushing and urging the council members to get that done, that, you know, we're not sitting here talking about how vulnerable we are with our bond ratings because we didn't meet our reserve obligations and our policies. We're not having those discussions because we're in good shape in terms of our reserve accounts. And so I think there's a lot of great things that have to be said as this is the mayor's last budget. A lot of his staff that have worked and dedicated their time and their life to putting the city back on track need to be complimented, because there has been a tremendous effort, and it shows. And again, I don't agree with it all. I think there's some really great things in here. We've got the consolidation of looking at what we've talked about for years, and mayor after mayor after mayor, by the way, have talked about for years on 12 to 2 or 23 to 4 or whatever you want to call it, and it's now looking at one way to streamline permitting and planning and land use and building and safety. And there's some great concepts in here that I'd like to recognize and applaud. It's no time yet for celebration, but worthy of applause. And I just wanted to commend you on all the work that's been done to date.
Thank you, Councilman.
Very much. Thank you, Mr. Englander, for that reminder. And I think it's an important point to remember as we go into these next couple of weeks. It's almost hard to remember now the extraordinary vulnerability that this city faced after 2008. And when people were talking then about deficits in the billions, and many people were talking about insolvency, and those conversations, although we still have much more work to do, those conversations are largely behind us now, and we still have to continue to be disciplined. We still have to continue to do this important work, but it really has been, it was beyond a daunting task. It was an almost overwhelming task to get us to this point, but the mayor and his team and the CAO and all of our city employees, as well as so many members of the public who weighed in on this and participated, really just grabbed themselves by the bootstraps, and we managed to get through some very, very difficult years. So thank you for reminding us of that. We do need to be mindful of how far we've come and how much great progress we've made. Mr. Kretz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, now that you and Mr. Englander have said all the positive stuff, which I agree with, now I can focus on some of the problems that I see in this budget. Number one, I see a structural danger in future years with some of what we've done that isn't necessarily so apparent. I know we're just starting to look at this and everyone's starting to analyze it, but it appears there are a certain number of unfunded positions which we'll have to fund in the future. I think that is a miss to get a handle on our structural deficit. There's some partially funded positions that are funded for part of a year, but then ongoing we'll have to fund them again. There's some new fully funded positions that aren't clear they're essential, like some new assistant general managers, et cetera, et cetera. There's some spending on things that are desirable, kind of things I thought we'd be spending on when I first started to run for this office, but not things that I thought we'd be spending on while we're still in an economic crisis that we do need to acknowledge. So I think we should be looking hard at the one-time expenditures and the ones that are not core to our ongoing mission to provide critical services to the city, help us restore our budget stabilization fund, which I think we all have agreed was cut too much. I think we have to acknowledge that even though we run a balanced budget, we are running a deficit every year with a very substantial LAPD overtime bank. I think that's a policy we need to end. Probably won't come as any surprise to any of you that I think we need to look at the number of hours of work as opposed to the number of officers. And is not clear to me, or ever has been clear to me, that by keeping a high number of officers and trying to reduce overtime, that's necessarily the best route. I think we need to provide one set of funding for officers and overtime and give that as a limit to the LAPD and make them stay within their budget. The fact is, having more officers and less flexibility probably makes them a little less effective as an entity. But I think they need to be given a number and to stick to it. You can't just overrun your budget and we say, sure, go ahead, and add to the deficit spending of overtime at the same time. I think it's a little bit fuzzy math to assume a give back that we hope our employees will give us, but we have no way to make them do it. I hope they'll see that we need that in terms of our ability to function as a city, but I think for us to be able to do that with credibility, we have to look at some of these other things, particularly the number of positions that we're adding that may give us ongoing structural problems. On the documentary transfer tax, I doubt we'll do it this year, but I think on a general basis, we should figure out some appropriate middle ground, and let's say $100 million or $110 million, and say, this is what we put into the budget every year for documentary transfer tax. And in the better years, that goes into a special fund for just the documentary tax overage, and in lower years, we still spend the same amount. Because otherwise, documentary transfer tax will be a roller coaster ride for us indefinitely. That's one way we could smooth it out. Also, on ongoing health issues, I think we do need to get a contribution from employees. At the same time, I think we need to focus more on how to actually get the providers' numbers down, whether it's more effort to focus on wellness and reduce a not overly healthy workforce, or whether there are other ways to create more competition and leverage the prices down. I think we need greater focus on that. I also don't know if we've looked at all at marijuana taxes, because that has been a roller coaster ride as well. But we should look at the impacts of Measure D, and indeed, were that to pass, you have establishments that would be all committed to paying that tax, so that could actually increase numbers of revenue. And while I wouldn't base a budget on that at all, we should have that calculation, and I'd like a report back on that. Perhaps after May 21st, if indeed that passes, to determine how that will affect our finances. And just one other question. I'm wondering whether a relatively minor issue, that the reserves and the Budget Stabilization Fund, whether having, let's say, a 5% reserve and a 1% Budget Stabilization Fund is looked at more positively by Wall Street and people that rate us, rather than a 6% reserve. Does it actually look like we have a smaller reserve because we're calling it something else? And I don't know if we've ever looked at that issue. So that's the one I'd ask for an answer on. The rest of it is just my thoughts going forward.
So the one question I have to answer when we meet with bond rating agencies and investors is that, are we following our own policies? And so this year I look forward to going and telling them that in fact we are, when it comes to the reserve fund, that we exceeded our policy, and that we are also for the first time actually hopefully have met our 1% responsibility towards our infrastructure, which is currently a city policy. Should your council adopt the recommended policy on budget stabilization, which is not too far off from what you recommended on the documentary transfer tax, but it also accounts for the other 6 taxes that are sensitive to the economy. In the future, we'll be asked, are we in fact meeting that policy? And so it is the question that we're asked is, are we doing what we say we're going to do? And so they leave the policy up to us. You know, you as a policymaker determine what that is. And 5% is the bare minimum, and so that's the standard across the country. The Budget Stabilization Fund, you know, I used to have this ongoing argument with Mr. Parks, because he would constantly ask me, why aren't we funding the Budget Stabilization Fund more to $500,000? And my response would be, because we haven't met the 5% reserve fund policy yet. And so until we hit that policy, you can't build another fund on top of it. Well, now we actually did that. So the second point is that you currently have a 1% policy towards infrastructure, and so this budget, in fact, already meets that policy. So now that those 2 things that have already been approved by your council have been met, then as we move forward, then in fact you're right, we need to move forward in a more consistent way by only limiting any dips into the Budget Stabilization Fund to 25%. But you have to meet your 2 policies that you already adopted first before you do that. And this budget does that, so it allows us then in the future to build a budget stabilization fund, and the CLA and I have a recommended policy as to how to proceed.
To follow up on that, we're looking at part of our budget being a request to go back on a 5.5% raise, which is a contractual obligation. How will they look at it if we are going back on our own obligations to our own employees?
Well, I think the question that will be asked is what is your backup plan if in fact you're not successful? And we had to respond to that last year when there were 209 positions that were slated for layoff that in fact were not approved in the budget and were deferred till January for further discussion. We explained to the bond rating agencies at that time is that your council wanted to see if revenues were tracking at the level that they were budgeted, and to determine whether any of those positions could in fact be put in other positions so that we would reduce the number of layoffs. So we would provide the same response, is that that it is our hope that we're successful in reaching a resolution. If we're not, we're going to have to confront that problem in January. And a discussion about backfilling those raises against potential cuts in departments or dipping into the reserve fund will have to be had. The challenge is, I think they'll be less concerned about what it means for between January and July, and frankly more concerned about what it means after July, because the total amount of savings that the city will get due to the strategy laid out in this budget in relation to COLAs and healthcare exceeds $100 million over the next 18 months. It's not a small amount. And so our response, I'm going to be forced to answer questions more in relation to the future than it is for a short period of time of 6 months.
And one last question. I know we're looking at creating some sort of a policy on our budget stabilization fund, but we don't really have a policy yet or any goals yet. I know there's been discussions. Do you have a sense of where that's going, and does this budget meet that, or does it undercut it?
The CLA and I submitted a report to your committee about 2 weeks ago that lays out a specific policy in place, and essentially it establishes that whenever the 7 most economically sensitive revenues exceed 3.4% growth, then anything beyond that should be put away to the Budget Stabilization Fund, and establishes a series of policies that would guide your discussion around dipping into that fund. And we suggest that at no given year that no more than 25% of it be used to deal with future deficits, because it's intended to be there to deal with unforeseen liabilities and for other greater uncertainty. The reason why that's important is because we want to maintain the 5% reserve fund at the minimum level and basically lock that away. And so as we experience fluctuations in the future, then we could rely on that fund, no more than 25%, to deal with any shortfalls. So in the best case scenario, it continues to grow and ends up being a healthy part of our overall finances. And it prevents the kind of financial difficulties where we're sort of managing month to month as we've experienced over the last 4 years.
And presumably this budget doesn't meet that policy.
Well, this policy hasn't been adopted, and if it would be adopted today, yes, you're correct, it would not meet that policy.
And would you recommend that we try and meet that policy, including for this budget?
Absolutely, and it's one of my recommendations that as new revenues come in, as you identify ways of freeing up revenues, that the goal should be to increase the Budget Stabilization Fund as much as possible.
Thank you.
Mr. LaBonge.
Mr. Chairman and fellow members of the committee, it's a great honor to serve in this role.
We're
After
delighted to
38
welcome you.
years, thank you, Mr. Chair. After 38 years in a variety of roles and finally into the City Council in 2001, this is my first shot at this very important committee. I hope to bring sensible concepts of citizen services, constituent services, of making sure that we are doing the job necessary in all ways that are possible. There's some values that I have that I will talk about, and we talk about public safety, public works, public health, which I think we should have an appointee, one person who does that. I do not support a city health department, but I think there should be a deputy mayor of public health or someone to be our liaison with the county health department. Working with public education, more at 301 as opposed to during the day, and after-school programs that enhance the lives of others, and then working aggressively on the MTA board in the public transportation area as we go forward. One of my key goals, Mr. Chairman, I have been working with the attorneys for the Department of Water and Power, is to create a special rate for the parks, libraries, and cultural facilities. And now that we charge back in those facilities, it's very important that we find ways to get a special rate from the Department of Water and Power for the water and power, the light, the fields at night, or that used for watering those fields. And it can be done. I've been working with the DWP on that, but I want to bring that to us, whether we could do it in this budget or get it done within the year. Those facilities are real important. Many times the Department of Water and Power, and it's a great agency which I'm very proud of, but they bring water lines through our parks, through our cities, streets, and there's no franchise fee, which I don't want to charge one. But at the same time, we should get something back. If it was Edison coming down Vineland Avenue, going into Universal, they pay a fee for that. So that's a key. I want to focus on public works, and mostly, Mr. CEO and Mr. Chair, on things that we could do in the next year as far as reorganizing. I'm adamantly passionate about moving street cleaning from street services to sanitation. The same people who clean our drains often have to clean more because the streets aren't done and coordinated as it could be because we don't give them support. I believe it was done in the same department. That would be a very important thing, and we'd have to phase it in, but let's start looking at it. I think it's very important that we move street cleaning to sanitation. Also, looking at contract administration. Do we move some of those inspectors to the Bureau of Engineering so that they work aggressively to get our projects done solely, not as a separate agency, but as a team? There are inspectors who should be able to know what is done and how it's done in a way that would work, but also have a very effective compliance part of our system as well. I think it's real key that we do that. Also, I want to ask that the CAO do us and a report back, because I heard your words, Mr. Chairman, in the beginning on the 311 system. We reduced it, but have we reduced it to where we're not listening to people as much? Do we need more operatives, more times, or whatever the case may be? I think that is real important as we look forward to it. Also, I hope there's enough money to hire from the hall. General Services is a great agency that supports many departments, but often if we hire from the hall, we don't have that cost that is related to a full-time employee. And there's many skilled workers at those halls who could help us. Police and fire, very important. I'm cautious on the issue of the reduction of the truck company, and the person who gets off that truck and goes and cuts into the building. Everyone has an assignment on the truck. We should know that going in of what we would do if we did reduce those positions. And Mr. Chair, I think there should be a valuable statement about earthquake preparedness. It's been 94 since the last earthquake. Prior to that, 71. Prior to that, 51 in Tehachapi, and all the way back to 33 in Long Beach. Preparedness should be something for Los Angeles, always constant because of that area there. I like what Mr. Corrett said about health and wellness, which is key for all of our personnel. I do want to say one additional thing about in reviewing the budgets last year's, we did reduce tree trimming, but we forgot to tell the trees not to grow. And now trees are growing at such a pace that they are covering up signs, street lights, and other things. They did not get the memo, Mr. Rosendahl. Something happened in some breakdown. So I think we have to address that. And also, his name was Robert Kennedy, no relation to the great senator, but Bob Kennedy was the street superintendent for trees many years, and he always liked the 60-40 split. We have great crews, but also we get a bang for our buck when we go to the private crews to get that balance for tree trimming, which for broad-based trimming, which is so key on that. Also, Mr. CAO, you know, and I don't know if you know, the Los Angeles Times is doing an expose on our street conditions. I'm reported to have the worst streets in the district, which really is a shock because I'm a street guy. At the same time, I have older neighborhoods. Older neighborhoods need upgrading. I also wanted to put on, we haven't, Mr. Fuchioka was the last time I had a strong run for it, but maybe, Mr. Chair, we need to buy a batch plant. That's a cement plant. If we're serious about fixing sidewalks and serious, we need to have a cement plant just like we have asphalt plants at the Olympic plant or the Valley plant that's so successful and so good for us. Also, I want to mention civic education, which is so key, whether it's our neighborhood councils, our police athletic leagues, our friends groups, whether they're friends of the parks, friends of the libraries, or friends of the arts. Civic education is very important in partnership. And also, I think this is very key, Mr. Chair. We all, when we get public works, we get it by district. I think now's the time we've got to stand up and say we've got to go by region. Because every Sunday morning, there's a crew from street services, usually one guy, who moves the steamrollers. And he goes to your district and my district and another and keep moving. We should concentrate in one region. I think we get more bang for the buck and look at ways that we could do that. We also should work with our partners in labor when there's daylight savings time to do increased work, and when it's not daylight savings time, there's less work, but balance it out for the full year and the safety. In northern cities with the longer daylight, they get a lot of their public works done, either double shift or additional shift. When there's daylight, let's get it done. But some of these ideas that I do want to bring forth as we go forward. And lastly, I'm cautious about the building and safety planning marriage, because it's I shouldn't use the term marriage, Mr. Rosendahl, at this time, because that's such an important value for everybody. Marriage is an important thing, but sometimes building and safety and planning are two different people in the sense. I hope I didn't get in trouble saying that, but if you know what I'm saying, right, Bill? We were talking last night. It's very important that we make sure that it works together for the people. Planners are different than inspectors. And lastly, strongly, the city attorneys should be off furlough immediately, especially proprietary departments. I rest my case, Mr. Chair. Great to be here. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Labange. All right.
I hope I didn't get in trouble.
Thank you all very much. We're going to go now to general public comment. I have 3 cards so far, and I'd like to invite up Art Sweatman, Simboa Wright, and Ankur Patel. And then we will follow that with general public comment with the Controller's Office.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My
Welcome.
name is Art Sweatman. I am a tree surgeon with the Bureau of Street Services Urban Forestry Division. I proudly work in CD 11 and CD 5. The CAO keeps talking about a shortage in street services, but yet there's $3.5 million budgeted for tree trimming this year by outside contractors. And I find it hard to believe that, we cannot start using some of our own workers for that. This isn't a one-time cost, trimming trees. $3.5 million is going to trim about 35,000 trees, and we have 800,000 trees in the city that keep growing. So this year is $3.5 million, next year will be $3.5 million, and so forth. When are we going to start actually hiring workers back into the city of Los Angeles? What we need to do as a city is stop making excuses. We need to start doing what this city is meant to do, and that's provide services for its citizens. We are here to provide those services. We want to do the work. We're ready to do the work responsibly, and we will cost less. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Simboa Wright, followed by Ankur Patel.
Hello, my name is Simboa Wright. I am a resident. I was born and raised here. And I love to work here, work for sanitation. I heard what the mayor's office had to say in the CAO, but a lot of the stuff that, let's think about the $27.8 million that SEIU Local 721 members found. Let's talk about the $96 million $96 million more that the city didn't even think that they would have, But the first thing the mayor and CEO says that, well, we did this, we did that, and we were able to balance the budget because we did these things. But who did it? Labor did it. You know why? Because we care about the city. We gave back. We did furloughs. I work for a funded department, a utility department. I did furloughs because I care about this city. But the mayor, the CAO, they take the credit. That's fine. But we're tired. I can't even afford the health care. I have 3 kids. But they always want to come back. 10% more? I can't afford that. I live in Los Angeles. You know how high it is to live out here. Think about the people that live and work out here. What's going to happen next? Do they want city employees to be on public assistance? We do our best to continue to make the services work here, and we ask that the city continue to work with us and get our ideas so we can continue to make the city the best city it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ankur Patel, followed by Jim Mcquiston.
Right. Hello. We found a couple $1 million here and there. $10,000 should go to bringing back the video conferencing from Van Nuys. It's not that much. Even if it was just Donna Pierman and Miriam Fogelson, the Valley should have the ability to connect here. Public participation is something that everyone talks about. Talked about civic engagement just a second ago. Give us the opportunity to speak from our home, from where we're close at Van Nuys. Something interesting that came up that I'd like to bring attention to is public matching funds. Right? We spent $26 million. $26 million in public matching funds for the March 5th primary. And all of that money, not all of it, but the vast majority of that money goes to well-funded, well-financed politicians already, right? It's difficult for the whole system is designed in a way that continues to marginalize grassroots candidates. We talk about public matching reform. That's something that we can look at. I think public matching funds, there's so much money there, and voter turnout is still, 20%? That's a shame. You could pay people to vote with that money instead of giving that money to the politicians to run commercials that no one appreciates, or some people do, but I don't. You're going to generate more turnout that way, right? Instead of, Australia has you fine people for not voting, we could do something pretty creative and give people money to vote if we are serious about engagement and getting people to participate. But I don't know if that's really where we're at right now. I don't know. Transparent budget. Mitch talked about that for a little bit. This is the most transparent budget we've had in a while. I failed to see that as well, but have a good day.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jim Mcquiston, followed by Julie Butcher.
Jim Mcquiston, you have my opening statement, some general comments in there. Basically, what I'm looking for this year is to see if we reorganize so that things get done a little bit easier, but we don't have to lay off people. As you know, I think that we've laid off too many. We should have gone after some very, very large income that we could have gotten and saved a lot of this problems. But within this, you'll notice some of my numbers there might be very encouraging. We seem to have increased some of our special funds, and if we actually put those funds into the departmental budgets, you see we don't have a deficit. We have a surplus this year.
Thank you. Our final speaker for general public comment is Julie Butcher. Ms. Butcher, welcome.
Thank you. And we anticipate the Coalition of City Unions anticipates a more detailed presentation. We'd like to remind you that the $847 million you'll be spending since 2009 came from sacrifices made by city workers. We stepped up. When the city was in crisis, we moved back agreements we had reached, binding legal agreements. We moved them back to save the city. Everything that city workers have done over the last 7 years is evidenced in the success of the city, in the future success. So that $847 million is part of a deal, and as we like to say, deal's a deal. That's what we've done. We've done well better than improvements in the equivalent of 10% cost to our health care. So we'd like to know how many 10% we'll be expected to come up with. This is bad math, mischief, and an attempt to hide the ball, deceive us in many ways. Rather than that, we'd actually love to see some vision about where we can improve services, not through contracts, which cost way more money. The trees do not trim themselves. We would like to trim trees. We have contracted or laid off all of that work. There are no more. They are not doing it. They're doing it in an emergency. And, you know, amazingly, trees find ways of trimming themselves. And so we respond to emergencies that cost more. We are here. The workers of the city have done everything we can possibly do to work with you. We expect your word to be good and for the city to live by its word. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just for the sake of the record, as Ms. Butcher alluded to, we will be hearing a presentation by the Coalition of City Unions here in this committee as part of these hearings. So we will have an opportunity to hear from our labor partners in much greater detail than public comment generally provides. All right. That brings us then to the City Controller's Office. I'd like to ask the Controller's representatives to come forward. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Claire Bartels, Chief Deputy Controller. Thank you for having me here this afternoon. Before I begin with the outline of the Controller's budget, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to say a special thank you to all of the men and women in the Controller's Office in every division who have been working side by side for the last 4 years that we've served in the Controller's Office to make sure that the city's resources are protected, that vendors are paid on time, and that the city payroll is made in accurate and timely fashion as well. So thank you for that, and thank you to all of them. I believe you have a copy of the Controller's letters highlighting her concerns about the Mayor's proposed budget. I'd like to outline some of those of paramount concern. Specifically, and first and foremost, is the complete elimination of all contractual services for the Office of the Controller. That deletion of $500,000 from the base budget for the Controller eliminates all outside auditing resources. That means the controller of the next controller will be severely hampered in his duties in carrying out charter-mandated responsibilities of auditing all city departments. He will be unable to hire subject matter experts for particularly complex technology audits, examples of which we have hired for matters of construction projects or the audits of Department of Water and Power, workers' compensation, and the like. Further, and perhaps of serious significance to all of this body, is the elimination of contractual services will silence the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Hotline, which, as you know, currently serves any residents or anybody who calls in. It serves for anyone to call in suspected fraud, waste, or abuse of city resources in actually 180 languages. That was instituted several years ago, and without funding would be absolutely silenced. I hope you'd agree that eliminating the fraud hotline sends the wrong message to the residents, to the employees, and to the businesses of the city.
Ms. Bartels, what percentage of the outside contract auditing budget goes for that hotline?
For the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline?
Yes. Or what is the amount that's
5%. 5% to the hotline itself. More for investigating. We investigate and refer that which comes into the hotline with our in-house audit resources.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. As has also been noted in past years, the Controller's Office has been reduced, its in-house staff has been reduced over the years from its peak following charter reform when the performance audit function was added to the responsibilities of the Controller. It's declined since that time by about 60%. We now have 13 in-house auditors serving under our Director of Auditing. And it is commonly known, best practices dictate that for every $1 billion in government funds, that 6 auditors or equivalent resources be given to the controller or be utilized. As a note, we looked at updated look at a couple of agencies in the surrounding California area and saw the city of Berkeley has as many auditors as we do with only a $300+ million budget, and city of San Diego has has 20 auditors for obviously a far reduced from the city of Los Angeles. So we are woefully under-resourced there, and therefore would make the plea, respectfully request the restoration of the $500,000 to the controller's base budget, and further go on to ask, as we have each of the past 4 years, for a reappropriation of an additional $250,000, bringing the total for outside audit resources to $750,000 again.
Now, did your office realize savings in this fiscal year in the outside auditing account?
No, we did not in the outside auditing account. However, we are going to realize salary savings that would be sufficient to be applied to that.
You ballpark the amount of that savings?
Probably $700,000.
Okay.
I might as well add then that there is, if you will, a successful program that we instituted a few years ago that was funded in past years but does not appear to be funded in this year's budget, and that's the accounting resource pool that we utilize retirees and deploy them citywide on a short-term basis for up to 120 days. That was funded originally at $350,000. I believe we were reimbursed by departments that use it for the most part. We should have roughly 200, 250. around $200,000 remaining in that allocation as well, and would ask that that be reappropriated for that specific purpose as well.
Would it make more sense to allocate some of what had been budgeted for outside auditing to hire more in-house auditors? In other words, is some of the savings of in your salary account due to the fact that there are contracted auditors who are performing the work that could be done within the office?
Twofold. The result of the salary savings is a direct result of the inability to have positions unfrozen to hire inside auditors. However, your suggestion would be considered appropriate if we were able to hire a number of auditors, say 4 more auditors in-house, and had a reduced allocation for the outside audit resources so that we could continue hiring subject matter experts on occasion. That would be welcomed.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for the Controller's Office?
Just a question.
Mr. LaBonge.
On the fraud, how many people have we prosecuted the last year?
We haven't actually, the Controller's Office doesn't actually prosecute. We've referred a number of cases to the district attorney, a number of cases to the city attorney and LAPD, and people have been arrested as a result. I can't comment on how many have been turned over.
But has it been 5 or 10 or do we know? I just want to know what it is. Maybe the city attorney will tell us, but
I can ask our director of auditing if he has a number handy.
just to,
Because so many are in progress, I don't know
right.
the end result.
I got it.
Fareed Safar, director of auditing, do you?
Controller's Office. We have one investigator who handles the type of investigation that Ms. Bartel was referring to. During the last year, we have a number, close to 5 cases that was they were referred to either to DA or city attorney or LAPD.
Got it. And is that consistent over the last 10 years, or is there a spike up and down, or that's all? I mean, because you've been with the Controller's Office a long time.
I've been in Controller's Office for 12 years.
Yeah, but is it about anywhere from 3 to 5 to 6 cases a year, or is it?
It is based on the number of investigators we have, which is 1, it's been consistent, yes. But if we have more
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kretz.
I know it'll be harder to quantify in this department, but I know years ago when I was working for the Board of Equalization during the economic downturn in the early 90s, it was originally proposed that the Board of Equalization cut a number of their auditors to save money. Then they did a more careful analysis and found that their auditors bring in, I don't remember the number, 5 times, 7 times their salary. And they realized that instead the smart thing to do was hire more auditors, which is what they ultimately did. I know it's harder to quantify here because you're not working directly with taxpayers, but is there any ability to quantify the fact that if we hired more auditors, we would either find more waste, fraud, and abuse, or find ways to save money that are a multiplier of their salary?
There is, indeed. And to your point, we have found as well that many other agencies, during the last 4 years, when we looked into what other agencies were doing during tough financial challenges, they were actually increasing their audit staff, presumably for the very reason. We do quantify. We actually post on a Controller's website an annual performance review of self-assessment of the Audit Division and the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Unit, and find that the return on investment is as much as 12, varies between 12 and 19, I believe, % in the past 4 years. That is, for every dollar invested in auditing resources, we've identified 12 plus in waste or efficiency or findings that you described. So, yes.
So I guess it would be a fair assumption that we would assume that by making these cuts in auditing resources, we would actually be costing ourselves money.
I would agree with that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Englander? Mr. Rosendahl.
Great meeting, by the way. You're doing a great job in laying everything out, and I appreciate it. Just for the record, how many audits will have been performed during your term as city controller by the close of the fiscal year? How many audits?
I can tell you that as of today, the controller has completed 90 audits and reports.
Will there be any more?
There will be some coming as soon as next week.
Okay, great.
And just by way of comparison, since we're discussing that, how does that compare to prior years?
Sheer numbers?
Yeah.
I believe Controller Chick, preceding our administration, performed about 80 or 89 over the 8-year span. We've been here 4.
So despite a reduction in the number of personnel, there's been a significant increase in the devotion of resources to performing audits in the Controller's office over that portion of time.
There has been perhaps a different approach as well, in recognizing that we had less resources. The approach to the focus of the audits had to change, and that is we took on more narrowly focused, specific audits that could be conducted in a shorter period of time in some cases in order to spread the limited resources.
Thank you.
Okay, and on that same question.
Yes, Mr. Rosendahl.
Okay. Will the 17 audit staff on the city's payroll be sufficient for the new controller to effectively accomplish their job? You have an opinion on that?
I do. We do. There's actually only 13 internal auditors assigned to work under Fareed in the auditing division. The other positions that you're seeing there are working for the demand audit section of the Controller's office, which is reviewing payments for the proprietary departments. So yes, the answer is yes. The Controller of the future will be hampered in their ability to carry out.
Great. And just for the facts, about what percentage of audits were performed by contracted auditors, and what criteria were used to determine when an audit should be done outside? How did we do that?
I'll refer that to Mr. Safar to elaborate, but I'll just refer it. Thank you.
We have about 5 audits performed by outside auditor in any given fiscal years. And generally, we use the special expertise if we need to. Areas that we do not have the expertise in-house, complex type audit, performance audit, for example, if you're looking at planning department, that requires a subject matter expert to conduct that audit. But is about 5 audits, and that's how much we can buy actually with the $750,000.
Is the deletion of a regular authority for an administrative deputy controller an exempt position the newly elected controller, whoever that would be, would normally have available for one of their at-will staff members?
That's correct. It is an at-will position.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any response from staff?
Outside to say, Claire is correct that every year your council allows the department to roll over funds that are unspent, and the CEO would certainly support that again this year to make up the shortfall. We don't know what that would be. We're hoping that it's more than 70,000, maybe as high as 700,000. Oh, maybe that's why I misunderstood. But certainly that would be consistent with what the practice has been in the past.
Just one final question, not for now, but for a report back. One of the policy changes that you recommended, that the Controller recommended in her letter to this committee, was consolidation of auditing functions from other departments within the Controller's office. I'd be interested to know specifically what auditing functions in which specific departments you're proposing should be consolidated, and also what whether that might whether that has an impact on the independence of having how can I say this? The different perspectives that come from multiple sources of auditing rather than consolidation into a single politically elected office. Does it make sense to have them consolidated under a single elected official as opposed to being diffused, having auditing responsibilities diffused, and what's done in other cities along those lines. So, but that's not a priority report back. That's a longer-term report back, I can tell already, but I would be interested in hearing that answer. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That will bring us to the City Attorney's Office.
It also says that the waste fraud hotline is provided in new languages. I'd like to know how many different languages have reported. What's that cost?
Can we ask the City Attorney's Office to come forward, please? Mr. Carter, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome to give some brief introductory comments.
Thank you. William Carter, Chief Deputy, City Attorney's Office. With me at the table are Pete Echeverria and William Mangan of the office. You've probably seen that the City Attorney, Carmen Tutanich, has submitted a written comments. Those were submitted to the Chair and the members yesterday. We have two primary comments. That is one, the recognition that the Mayor's office has proposed a 4.6% increase to the salary accounts for our employees, and we greatly appreciate that, which will allow the office to not have to impose furloughs. That's a major development. It's a very positive development for all of our employees who have been struggling under those furloughs now for 4 years. The primary objection that the City Attorney raised in his letter are the vacant positions being eliminated, and I believe at this time there's approximately 24 that are being recommended for elimination. We would ask that those not be eliminated, or to the extent possible, eliminate as few as possible. The reason is this: as we laid out, and I won't belabor it any longer than in the letter, we've lost a large number of vacant positions. When you add that to the number of people that we've lost through ERIP and normal attrition, the office is down in excess of 100 attorneys. That's a huge amount of attorney loss. As you know, the City Council work is done to great extent based on the time and amount of effort the City Attorney can put into drafting, reviewing ordinances, and that things slow to a grind if our attorneys can't get to that work. It's very unfortunate. We all have heard that. On the criminal side, we obviously are prosecuting cases every day. And on the civil side, we're defending the city against lawsuits. And just as I was coming in here, I got great news of a major victory on our civil side. I don't want to jump the gun too much, but there was a very tragic case last fall where a young man was shot by LAPD on the Ventura Freeway. He was hit by a number of rounds after a car chase. He sued the city for $120 million. He sued us in federal court today after a motion to dismiss filed by our attorneys. The federal judge dismissed the lawsuit against the city. That was done by one of our attorneys, Denise Mills, who's in the police litigation unit. We all saw what happened on television. You never know what a jury's going to do. But fortunately, we had a major victory today, and the city will not have to pay any money in that lawsuit. That's the kind of things we do every day. If we lose our vacancies, yes, if furloughs end, that's a fantastic development. That's great news. That still does not make up for the fact that we are down many, many lawyers. And I know, Councilman Krikorian, we've talked about this. There's a time where we're going to just have to hire experienced lawyers that can backfill on the civil side, the municipal side, so that we can continue to represent the city. Those are really the only comments I have. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. I wanted you to give a chance to give a little introductory comment because we actually don't have a letter from the city attorney. If it came in, we haven't received it yet. So, okay, I guess it's coming in now, but you thank you. Gave a little bit of an overview, and that's appreciated. I think it's terrific news that there's no proposed furloughs. We really need to get on a clear path to restoring positions in the city attorney's office so that our council can defend the city and represent the interests of the city, which I believe a well-run city attorney's office will do much more effectively than outside counsel will, and more cost-effectively as well. Along those lines, Mr. Carter, since you mentioned that particular case, last year we budgeted $37.85 million for liability claims. Number came in at around 42.25. What would you say are the contributing factors to that? And importantly, we've, in this budget, have again budgeted $37.85 million. Is that a reasonable amount, do you believe, to budget, or is it not?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm Bill Mangan. I'm the Chief Budget Analyst. 25% of our liability budget this year has been gobbled up by appeal bonds in the federal court. They were unanticipated. They're for cases that didn't turn out as well as we would have expected. They had to be appealed, and of course the court requires a bond, which in some cases includes the addition of anticipated interest on the bond. And they were about 25% of the budget. Had that not occurred, we would have been under budget.
And so is it the office's opinion that $37.85 million for the coming fiscal year is a reasonable estimate of? I know this is maybe the one area of our budget that may be the hardest to accurately predict. But
based on what I've seen in the mayor's recommended budget, not only the allocation for the two liability accounts, but the addition of a UB at $6 million additional in reserve, it should be adequate for next year. That's our view at this point.
Okay. Very good. Mr. Kretz, anything for the city attorney?
Yeah. Obviously, it's good that we're not talking about layoffs and furloughs, but there is a cut to positions that are not filled at this time, which continues to cut back the department. How problematic do you think that is, and what do you recommend that we be looking at?
Thank you, Councilman. I will defer to Peter Chevarria, whose civil branch, I think, has the greatest need at this point.
Let me say, it's particularly critical at this point in time because we have, for the past several years, tried to live and have lived within the budget that, as much as we came and made our concerns known, we lived within the budget that was afforded us, and did not even go to managed hiring to replace a lot of the positions that we lost. We lost many of our most experienced attorneys. Of that 102 or so attorneys that we lost, they were all the senior attorneys and the more experienced ones. We're at the point right now where we have, for example, in terms of litigation, our sole construction litigation attorney is about to retire within the next couple of months. We need to replace that person. If we don't have a vacancy to put a new hire into that position with that particular type of expertise that we don't have in-house right now, and we need to hire somebody with that kind of expertise, if we don't have a position to hire an individual, we won't have that expertise. We're losing two of our subrogation attorneys, and they are, again, a specialized expertise. We could train someone had we had the positions and the ability to move someone to become a trainee under them for the last year and a half, we would be in a better position, but we don't have that kind of staffing right now. So these positions, and there are several other examples I can give you of that same type, they're critical. and we were just about, given all the other demands on our management time, we were just about to go to managed hiring to ask for authority to fill some of these positions where the needs are the greatest when we found out that these were being swept.
And how about in the criminal?
If I may, Councilman Koretz, criminal is also struggling. As you know, we've lost, the bulk of the hit comes out of criminal. As you know, on the criminal side, we have discretion whether to file a case or not. When LAPD arrests someone, we don't have to file that case. We don't have to file it, but we do. A DUI, a sexual assault, petty theft, graffiti, we file those because of the public safety aspect involved. But we also have to, we have no discretion in defending the city when it gets sued. So we've been stealing from Peter to pay Paul. We've been stealing from criminal to put in civil. And how we've been backfilling criminal is through the Reserve Deputy Program. But you cannot run a prosecution office on volunteers. As good as they are, you cannot run them on the office on volunteers. But we do need to hire on the criminal side as well. When we do get to hire again, we're going to be focused on the civil side to get that expertise so that we can do the work that you need to do on the council. It's critical, as well as defend the city. But we also do need to start looking on the criminal side. But fortunately, we have Reserve Deputy Program that is helping out, but that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable.
And do you have a priority choice if you had to choose between filling these positions and dealing with some of the more technological and physical changes like ergonomic workstations and technology upgrades? Do you have a preference?
If I have a choice between people and furniture, I'll take the people. And I'm not dismissing the need for technology upgrades and the ergonomics, but as you know, if there are not available or experienced attorneys to do your work, it's very frustrating for you and for everyone if the work doesn't get done. And we need the people.
And one last question. I know we've been working for almost 4 years on trying to get the ACE program implemented, which I think is likely to happen next year. Do you think we should be recognizing some savings as part of the budget? And do you think there will be savings as a result of that?
Well, I hope ACE happens this fiscal year. I know we recently appeared in front of the Budget and Finance Committee, and I know Councilman Englander and Councilman Krikorian and Councilman Labange inquired and made some important requests, and we are going to be following up on that. We're drafting those responses now. We do believe that ACE will do two things. One, it'll alleviate some of the burden on criminal and the courts, but it also has the side benefit of getting immediate abatement and even some revenue neutral benefits for that. In the end, we're still going to need bodies and that's on the criminal side. We're still going to need some bodies to oversee the ACE program, because not every case will end up in ACE as a citation. You'll still have to file cases. That will not, however, alleviate the need on the civil side. The civil side will still need the expertise for transactional or civil defense. But ACE will, at a minimum, be revenue neutral, but we suspect over time will be generating some funds for the general fund, because right now our estimate is between 15 and 20,000 cases a year could immediately go into ACE just by LAPD and Animal Services writing those citations.
Thank you.
Yeah, you made a comment that you don't want the city attorney's office to steal from Peter to pay Paul, and I would suggest that the city attorney's office not steal anything to pay either Paul. So
and
just going on the record.
Certainly, Paul has never been paid.
That's right.
Pay both Pauls.
Mr. Carter, I apologize if this is set forth in the letter. As I say, I don't yet have it in front of me. So, but I did want to know if there's a slight increase in the city attorney's budget. There's about another little over $4 million coming this year. Is is the way that that increase is appropriated within the department consistent with the city attorney's priorities, or are there proposals that you would suggest for shifting among accounts without increasing funding, but setting forth more in one account and less in another, perhaps? I think it's very important that police liability is enhanced, and certainly that neighborhood prosecutors are enhanced as they are in this budget, but I'm wondering if the city attorney has a different view.
Well, I'm sorry.
No, it was me. If I may make a preliminary comment, my understanding of that amount is that it essentially does away with furloughs. It's not an enhancement of our budget at all, other than by doing away with furloughs. So it doesn't equate to any additional resources for the office at all.
Yeah.
The time that would otherwise be spent on furloughs, most of our attorneys are spending those hours working in any event. So it doesn't increase productivity or give us additional positions. I don't know if you have anything further.
That was correct. Thanks, Pete. My interpretation of the 4.6 increase in salary funds accounts means no furloughs, which means we're kind of back at static. We're not gaining any people. We're not gaining any more funds. It's just we're paying for time that a lot of our people are already spending. It's just we don't have to impose furloughs now. And so we're not even broken even, because we're still kind of out of whack on the salary counts. But we do have sufficient funds now in the proposed budget that all furloughs will end as of July 1st, 2013, which means our people will be fully paid for all of their work, and many of whom are already working through their furloughs. But we're not gaining any new people. We're not gaining any new money anywhere. It's just we're kind of static.
The CAO mentioned in his opening presentation that workers' compensation liability continues to increase year after year. In addition to that, in last year's budget, the council requested that the city attorney work with the CAO to reduce potential liability in selected targeted departments. Can you speak a little bit to what has happened over the course of the last year in terms of reduction of workers' compensation liability, and what efforts have been made to reduce the potential for outside liability with regard to those targeted departments?
Well, I know with respect to workers' compensation, our office is working much more closely with personnel, and they now have an ADR or a turbocharged resolution process where matters get resolved sooner rather than later, which there may be an increased upfront cost, but the long-term costs are decreased. And that's really our strategy. You might see a spike in payouts initially, but over time they will decrease, because a couple things that we did in working with personnel and the council is it allowed us an increase in the settlement cap from $50,000, I think, up to $100,000, where we could settle a case without having to come back to council, which meant, you know, if you were negotiating a case for $51,000 and you didn't have authority, you could waste months and months and months, and then the case ended up settling for $75,000. But with this increased authority, we can settle more cases now, and then over time the amounts of money will drop off. Now, from a litigation strategy, that's working. And in terms of other personnel, increased claims from LEPD or fire department, I'm not sure if Pete or Bill, you've seen any data on that, but I know from the city attorney's office, we have a better relationship with personnel. We're getting more cases resolved sooner up front, which will save money in the long run.
And if I may, what we've done with respect to the resolution of claims is a couple of things. We've actually assigned more workers' compensation as opposed to some of the other, not that it's not a critical position, but some of the more critical positions that require expertise and they're more complex. Workers' compensation can be handled by younger, relatively less experienced attorneys. So we have transferred over the last 3 years, several attorneys into that group to increase our staffing. Beyond that, what we focused on in the last couple of years has been in trying to resolve issues of employability, if you will, determining whether somebody is going to be referred for treatment and get them treated and then back on the job, or if it's going to be denied, then give them some accommodation and get them back on the job right away. That does two things. It increases productivity from city employees, but it also avoids the penalties, which we were suffering significantly from, the city was significantly from in years before. So we've actually been effective at reducing the penalties that were imposed for just not handling the matters as quickly as possible. That has resulted from not only the efforts of the office in conjunction with personnel, but also the training that our office, hand in hand with personnel, put together for all the city departments. And that was rolled out a little over a year ago. Personnel directors and workers' comp employees within the departments have received that training, and it has really paid off, I think.
Yeah, our office, in conjunction with personnel and the mayor's office, conducted mandatory training. I think it started either just before last fiscal year or early this fiscal year.
Just before, yeah.
Very good to hear. It has always been very important to me that we continue to be aggressive in trying to drive those costs down, both in terms of responding to claims of injury, but also in preventing them in the first place, and having a risk management strategy that actually eliminates or reduces injuries as well as responds more effectively to them. So I'd like to ask, again, this is not a priority, this is one of those B-list reports back, but I would like to get a report back with policy suggestions or procedural suggestions that the city attorney and personnel might recommend for how we might improve our progress in driving down costs of workers' compensation and also disability claims and failure to accommodate and that category of claims with regard to training, risk reduction, and as well as the legal response to those things. Yes. Mr. Kretz.
Just to follow up to that, some cities have, with some success, found consultants that are very good at helping to drive down workers' comp costs. Have we ever engaged a workers' comp reduction expert to try and make that happen in LA?
I don't know if personnel has had any experience with it. I'm not personally familiar with having done that, not through our office in any event. I can tell you that our attorneys have been providing training to our third-party administrators also in the handling of claims, expediting the handling of claims and ways to reduce those costs as well. So we have been doing that for actually the contractors that we've hired.
So I don't know if that would work as a piggyback to the report back that you asked for, but it's something we should look at, because I know other places have done that kind of analysis and saved significant money.
That should certainly be part of the same report, I think.
Great.
Mr. LaBonge, anything for the city attorney?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple things on the furloughs. Are we on track? July 1st, Mr. Carter?
Yes, I think
absolutely.
I believe so.
Especially for the proprietary departments too.
For everybody.
So that has happened there.
Yes.
And I just wanted to know, with the delayed maintenance of some issues, and like I said, the Los Angeles Times doing an expose on street surfaces, conditioning, all that stuff. What is our claim load on some of the street work? Do you know? And if you don't know now, you'll know the next time I see
We probably get 30 to 40 claims a month.
But is that $600,000 or is it, you know, I don't know.
Oh, it's
I mean, I think we should
tens
put
of thousands of dollars.
We got a little talking over here like they used to be in school. What do you say? What do you know?
I was just trying to clarify. If you meant the trip and falls, those kinds of claims?
Trip and falls, yeah.
Yeah, they're substantial.
So it
Go
could
get
go
your report.
like $5 million or?
I would say in the range of maybe $1 million.
$1 million, but that's substantial, you know, as we look at that, what it is. And I do worry about, as I mentioned, the trees. And I know Ron Lorenzen, who's our street tree guy, is street tree superintendent, very focused on this, trying to get to those. But I would hate to see us have a signal be blocked, and then all of a sudden
Those are the most critical.
Those are the ones. And the other thing, too, Mr. Carter, I'm looking at you because you're next to the CAO, so I'm giving you the thing. We lost a multi-million-dollar on a street paving, no lane striping. It was in San Pedro. It was when Ms. Hahn was here. And they paved the street, did a good job, but they didn't stripe the street. And there was a tragedy. We still have some of that. So I'd like to just, Mr. Chair, just ask that they direct some memo to department heads to be up to date on their striping, because that's an accident waiting to happen, plus a suit possibly waiting to happen. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, city attorneys.
Thank you.
We have a great deal of that, and that'll certainly be a suitable set of questions for the Department of Transportation when they're here as to how we can better coordinate with street services. Final question from me, and that is on outside counsel. In the last budget year, we significantly overspent the outside counsel budgeted estimated amount, and I recognize that at least some of that was probably attributable to the fact that so many of the in-house lawyers were furloughed and not available, and the workload continued. But I also understand that many of the outside counsel are for specialized purposes, specialized kinds of cases that we might not be able to handle in-house. So I'd like to know, how did we miss the mark on the estimated outside counsel expense so badly last year, and what can we do, what have we done, what should we continue to be doing in order to monitor outside counsel billing and reduce the overall cost? I mean, I will give credit to the office. We had an incident in Claims Board not long ago where in a Claims Board hearing, I had two named partners from a law firm show up to give testimony in the Claims Board to describe a case. It was absurd. And thankfully, your office insisted that they not bill for that time, and I appreciate that. What other sort of steps are you taking to control outside counsel expenses?
Well, Councilman, I know last year we recommended $4 million in outside counsel fees, and we were given $3 million. So we estimated $4 million last year. We figured that given furloughs and the current workload, $4 million would probably be close, not enough, but close, and we were budgeted $3 million. So we, in our opinion, we were already $1 million under what we needed for last year. In terms of historically, I know when in July of 2009, the office was spending at least $25 million a year in outside counsel. That was total, $25 million, and we got it down to 12 the first year. Third year we got it down to 8. We went from 25 to 8, and then by then furloughs had kicked in, and you just cannot operate with furloughs and that low amount of outside counsel. So we've now peaked back up total maybe 12 or 13. That number that you're talking about, that we were asking, what was the general fund amount? And that general fund amount under Rocky Delgadillo last year, I think he was at $6 or $7 million a year. So we got down to $3 million a year general funded outside counsel. So we were cut way low. When Rocky Delgadillo had that $6 to $7 million a year general fund outside counsel, he had that many attorneys. By the time we got cut down to $3 million general fund outside counsel, we had a lot fewer attorneys, and they were on furlough. So we got triple whammied. And so last year we were dealing with a lot of FLSA cases. We had a class action lawsuit on Ardone. We had a lot of other matters that we needed outside counsel. And we used them because we're not going to prejudice the city by not using outside counsel when we need them. Now, having said that, what we've done to reduce outside counsel is take in more work that we should be doing. Secondly, when we do use outside counsel, we don't use outside counsel to do the work. We use outside counsel to supervise us doing the work. That way, you have an outside counsel who has expertise telling our lawyers how to do it, so you get minimum work by them and the maximum expertise developed by your own people. We also asked for off-the-top 15% cut in their fee, which they did. We also have and Haley back there, who's our taskmaster when we're looking at outside counsel fees. So we look at those very closely. And as you pointed out, when we heard that there were people in here that shouldn't be in here, or at least 2 of them that shouldn't be here, we said, you're not going to bill for that. And we watch it very closely. Both myself and others who have been in private practice, and also the city attorney who's been in private practice, and the chief legal advisor to the city attorney who've been in private practice, we look at the bills very carefully. We're very careful. We don't want to use outside counsel. We think we should be able to do it ourselves and develop the expertise. Unfortunately, given this crisis we've been in, and I know the CAO and others, we've had this conversation, they are now experiencing their own outside counsel issues because of some of the conflicts we had with the CRA in the city. And it's extraordinary how expensive it gets when you have to use outside counsel. So we appreciate getting the extra money this fiscal year, but we had to spend it to defend the city.
Thank you. Mr. Rosendahl.
Very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your last answer, too. That's exactly where I'm at. Let me just restate it. What policy guides the use of outside counsel rather than keeping it in-house? How do you make that final decision?
Usually it's an expertise. If we don't have the in-house expertise, it could be a very specific type of activity, like maybe it's the FAA, or maybe down in the port we're dealing with air pollution or bond issues, or class action, or employment, like the FLSA, or Fair Labor Standards Act cases that LAPD and others get sued. They're very time intensive. They're not class actions, but you have hundreds of plaintiffs, and each plaintiff has to be addressed in discovery and others. So it's really based on the express specialty, and then after that it becomes the time.
Appreciate that very much. What progress have you made on your recommendations of the last several years to work more closely with the Office of Finance to improve debt collection?
We have a very good relationship with Office of Finance, as you've probably heard. Last year, our office, in conjunction with the Office of Finance, collected $7.5 million in uncollected taxes. In 2008, 2009, that was $700,000 and maybe $900,000. So we've blown the doors off collecting taxes, uncollected taxes. With Office of Finance, they're doing a great job.
Great. Did you want to comment on it, Mr. Chair? Okay. Just to final it up, there have been we did this in audit the other day. There have been highly publicized reports of large amounts of uncollected city taxes from private parking operators. What progress has been made to collect these debts, and what strategies can you recommend preventing recurrence in the future?
Well, I know we meet very regularly with the Office of Finance. Antoinette Cristoval and her staff have done a great job speeding up the process. They've created a system where they can know in a more timely fashion who owes the city money, and then they can start a lien procedure. We've worked with them on a number of cases to, as soon as they find out the city has owed money and these people may or may not be trying to transfer their assets, we can jump on the case, file a lawsuit. We've been very successful on some of these parking lots that owe money. We've also been working very closely with the Office of Finance and the Sheriff's Department to get keepers in there. We'll put liens. We'll actually have a Sheriff's Department keeper sit in the parking lot and collect the money from the people who owe the parking.
Do you have any idea how much money we're looking at?
Well, I think there are millions of dollars owed to the city, tens of millions of dollars owed to the city in parking. I think the greatest thing you have to do, and we've been talking about this for many years, you need to get the police commission to revoke permits, parking permits, in a timely manner and not reissue them.
Thank you.
And along those lines, working with the Police Commission and Office of Finance and the Council, there have been a couple of ordinances that have been prepared in that regard. There's one that's coming forth, I think, this week, to ensure that the Police Commission, once there is a a violation, if you will, of a parking operator not paying either the parking occupancy tax or the business tax, that the police commission can take action to revoke their permits. Moreover, that they can impose requirements for electronic and other types of technologies to track the use of the parking lot and the collection of the funds there as well. So I think it's been really a strong city effort with us working with finance and the police department as well, the police commission, as well as with council offices to cause that to happen. And we're going to start seeing more and more of that result.
Very good. What's the current status of the Consumer Protection Trust Fund, and what steps, if any, are there that you could recommend that we might be able to take to utilize that fund to relieve the general fund of some of its burden?
Well, are you talking about the penalty monies we collect? Last year we collected $8.5 million in penalties, and we get to keep half of those. The other half we have to split with the district attorney, unfortunately, until the legislature changes. And that $4-point-some million we used to fund our environmental and consumer protection activities. That was part of the budget of last year, and we're on track to do that again this year. I think $4 million again is what our benchmark is. Just last week, Home Depot submitted a $1.4 million check to the city attorney's office as part of the penalty in the air pollution case we successfully won against them. So that money will go right into the consumer protection account, which is part of our budget benchmark. And Bill, I'm not sure how much, if any, we will have left at the end of the fiscal year, but
very little. We will have transferred by June 30th. We will have transferred $4 million to the CAO for our budget funding obligation, and whatever money would remain is going for some law clerks and some investigative costs. But we should net zero at the end of the year, and we need some more settlements.
We had some ideas we can talk about at some point, but when we collect those fines under the Business Profession Code, we're statutorily required to split them in half, even if the district attorney's office did absolutely nothing on the case. What we have been doing, our strategy...
Sorry, but that's pursuant to state statute?
Yes. Yes. Business Profession Code Section 17206C, as in cat. One of the strategies we've used is we try to work on a regional case with an attorney general or a DA's office. So on the Home Depot case, even though the LA County District Attorney's Office chose not to join the suit, we worked with the Orange County District Attorneys, which allowed us to keep all of the $1.4 million. We didn't have to split it. We can't always work it that way, but like on the billboard cases, on the CBS Outdoor case, we got $4 million, and the district attorney had absolutely no involvement in that case. We had to give $2 million right off the top to the district attorney. So there are ways we can work on that with the councilman and the chair and the CAO.
All right. Thank you very much. Any response or concerns from staff?
The only thing to add is that to restore those positions, it would be an additional $3 million, and that does not include related costs.
All right. Thank you very much. That brings us now to the... Oh, yes, Mr. LaBonge. Sorry.
You know county council, right?
Yes.
And next to your CEO, he had a lot of county experience. Can you learn from county council on anything?
I can learn every day from anybody.
Okay. But is any business enterprise? Because, see, I think that's what we've been transforming these last 15, 20 years. No. On when we get a check, we deposit the same day. You know, we used to sit it around for a long time. Just a friendly suggestion to meet with your attorney generals, the district attorneys, the city attorneys of your associations to come up with best practice ideas for cost efficiency. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the Office of Finance. Ms. Christoville, welcome.
Good afternoon. Okay.
And we do have your letter. Thank you very much. Thank you for providing that in advance. If you want to provide a very brief comment, then we'll go right to questions.
Okay. Thank you so much. I do want to, first of all, thank my staff for their tireless efforts in collecting the city's revenue, as well as the investment and treasury staff as well. Of course, we have limited staff, and so we make every effort to utilize our staff to the best possible to generate and collect revenue that's due to the city. I have to say that since the creation of the department and the consolidation of the Treasurer's Office into the Office of Finance, our overall responsibilities include collecting over $2.5 billion in revenue annually, as well as managing a $50 billion cash and debt management program, and also actively managing an $8 billion investment portfolio. Our budget, at least over the 5-year period, we have 75 positions that have been eliminated. And in the current budget, there's an additional 4 positions that are proposed for elimination. Overall, we've had...
For filled positions?
No, unfilled, vacant positions.
Okay.
Which we're fine with. Overall, we've seen an 18% reduction in our workforce. But we have managed that through a number of means, particularly the online efficiencies that we have in place for businesses to conduct their business with the city 24/7 without having to interact with any of our employees. Our bank fees, we've been able to reduce them, the general fund appropriation, by $7 million. That's since the consolidation of the Treasurer's Office into the Office of Finance. We've reduced our printing and binding costs by 66%, closed 3 public counter offices. And with all that, with our finance revenue programs, we've generated an additional $1.2 billion in general fund revenue to date since the inception of the Office of Finance. Excuse me. We've seen an increase in the city's tax rolls by 95%, which we've increased the number of registered taxpayers from 238,000 to 465,000 registered taxpayers. And we've implemented a number of best practices, and I can certainly speak to those if you like. I know that was something that you had indicated in your letter that you wanted to hear from departments about. And we have a number of best practices planned or in progress presently for the for next fiscal year.
Great. Don't think we need to go into too much depth on those because it doesn't appear that there's going to be dramatic changes in your budget this year. So why don't we go straight to questions? Mr. Rosendahl.
When you think about it, because we're consolidating and we're making things more efficient, and the taxpayers like that, but what are the positive or negatives to the consolidation of finance and treasury?
Well, the positive is that we're actually saving the city about $1 million annually in costs that otherwise would have had to been expended if we had those 2 separate departments. Right. The other thing that I mentioned, too, that since the consolidation, we have reduced the general fund appropriation for bank fees from a high point of $13 million to now $6 million. So there's a $7 million reduction on the general fund appropriation that otherwise had to have been appropriated to pay for banks' fees. So we've seen a significant reduction there. The other efficiency or consolidation efficiency is really looking at the overall operations. We have economies of scale because we now have one administrative group that's handling both treasury and finance responsibilities. We've also looked at ways to address some of the other system issues that we have. We had a study done where we have identified that we do need a treasury management system that we believe will certainly address some of the inefficiencies that we have with the 10 disparate manual and automated systems that we're using for treasury activities. So we've seen substantial improvement with the consolidation, and we continue to look and find ways to reduce costs, increase revenue, and certainly utilize economies of scale.
Well, I certainly want to thank you. I've had the pleasure of serving on this committee for the whole 8 years I've been in government, and you have been so flexible and so creative, so engaged, and you're a true civil servant and an asset to the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Rosenthal's previous question to the city attorney with regard to parking tax collection. And this budget provides for $100,000 in contractual services related to parking occupancy tax collection and anticipates $400,000 in revenues to be derived from that program. Can you talk a little bit about the program, and if we're getting a 4-to-1 return on the dollar, would it be would we get a proportionate rate of return if we invested more in that, or is that a right-sized program?
Well, I mean, certainly I do want to thank the City Attorney's Office for their comments. We have worked collaboratively with their office as well as the Police Commission's Criminal Investigation Division and certainly our staff. So working collaboratively with the group, we have seen a substantial improvement in parking tax collections. If you go back to fiscal year 10-11, parking tax revenue was $83.2 million. What is projected for this fiscal year is $91.7 million. That's a 10% increase, or $8.5 million in additional revenue. And not all of that's because of the economy, because the economy is still very slowly improving. It's because of the enforcement efforts, the collaborative work of all three offices, that we have been able to really send a message to the parking community that the city is very serious about ensuring that the money that is due to the city is, in fact, remitted. For fiscal year 13-14, the projection for parking tax revenue is $94.9 million. So if you take the low point of 2 years ago to what we're projecting for 13-14, that's about $12 million in additional revenue that the city will certainly receive. The other thing that I think is very important are the various ordinances that are en route or have been implemented. The parking tax collection bond, we're working to have that in place, working with the Parking Association to have that in place by January 1 of this fiscal year. The revenue control equipment that Pete Echeverria spoke about is an ordinance that they are releasing and will be going forward. While we strongly felt that the equipment should be permanent control equipment, we recognize that the Police Commission feels that they should have an option in terms of the types of equipment, so we would certainly support that. One other important thing that's in the ordinance that Mr. Echeverria had talked about is the fact that a number of parking lot operators do not like to cooperate with our auditors. So within that particular ordinance, what it states is that if they don't cooperate, we can go forward and request that their parking lots be revoked. We think it's important that we get the cooperation because what happens a lot is that we would issue an estimated assessment, a very high assessment, because we don't want to undercut the city. And then what the parking lot operators will do is come back and then want to cooperate and provide us with actual data, which basically delays the process. So I think a lot has been done, and in particular there was a large parking lot scofflaw that did settle with the city, but they did not settle until after we had their lots revoked, working with the Police Commission and the City Attorney's Office. So I think through the collaborative process and the efforts that have been made to date, we've seen substantial improvements.
Thank you. Mr. Englander.
Yes, thank you for that. And we've been working a lot on the ordinance as well in my committee in public safety. And so I think it's recognizing not so much what the Police Commission's issue was with the installment, but using that as an enforcement mechanism if they ever fail. And it would hopefully run with that land as well, but I appreciate it. With that, you had a few requests that seem reasonable and justified, and I was hoping for some report backs on your specific requests. And one is that to upgrade a Treasury Accountant 2 to a 2A3, it was a $6,000 and change increase, but it would complete the Treasury consolidation, as you'd mentioned, I believe, in your letter.
Yes.
So if we can get a report back on that, along with the upgrade of the 5 tax-compliant officers. I think for all 5, it was a total from level 1 to 2s of less than $25,000.
That is correct.
So I think that we should find a way to do that. And then in addition, the other one that stood out to me was you had 8 tax auditor upgrades held in managed hiring for the last 2 meetings. Each one of those, according to your notes, have a net revenue of these positions of $400,000 each.
That is correct.
And so wanted to find out what's going on with managed hiring on those 2 particular positions, because I think we had a new policy in place for MHC for revenue producing positions. Mr. CEO, if you can address that.
All of the managed hiring requests made by the department have been approved within 30 days of being submitted. And so over the last year, we've received 26 requests to the CAO. 20 have been submitted to managed hiring and approved. 1 request is on hold for return without action, and 1 is under the CAO's review. So out of the 26 requests submitted to my office, 20 of them have already been approved. And we do a turnaround about no more than 30 days.
So if these 2 are being held, if you can just let us know when this item comes back, where those 2 positions are, particularly if they are revenue generating at $400,000 roughly annually. It would make sense. So I'd like to look at that. And then in your tax amnesty program, the revenue anticipation is about $5.5 million. It seems a little aggressive. If it's only been 4 years, the last time, if it's based on the last time we had an amnesty, that was an 8-year lull, I believe. So now it's been a 4-year lull. What's your response on that? What do you think about the accuracy of that projection?
Well, we think it's a good projection, in particular with the 2001 amnesty. Of course, we collected, I think it was around $25 million. And then the following tax amnesty was in 2009. We collected, I think, $20.6 million, but the span was about 8 years. So now we're looking at a shorter span, 4 years, from the 2009 amnesty to the 2013 amnesty, should it be approved. Also, the economic conditions are such where the ability for these businesses to pay is not as great. The other thing is that we have implemented the tax lien program, and we've had a huge success with that particular program. So, and when I say that, the estimate initially was about $1 million annually. We collected $10 million to date, and it's only been in operation since December of 2010. So it hasn't been very long with that particular program. So we do see some of the available money or revenue that might be generated from the lien program being offset by some of the collections for the amnesty program being offset by the lien program and also the economy in terms of businesses being able to pay. But we're certainly hopeful. We would like to, hope that we could exceed that, but we're being cautious in that regard because we don't know if we're going to get as big of a return as we have with our prior amnesty programs.
Thank you.
And just a quick follow-up to that point. There's $200,000 in cost appropriated to pay for that program. Is that a limiting factor? Or, in other words, if we were to supplement that, would your expectation that potential revenues increase, or is 5.5 probably around the maximum that you would be able to achieve with an amnesty program in general?
Well, the programming costs really are pretty flat and basic. It's for print, radio media, as well as brochures and outreach, and sending targeted notices to these businesses who owe monies. So I would not foresee any increase in the $5.5 million if we increase the cost to run the program.
Okay.
I'm more concerned about the fact that there's limited availability in terms of what is out there and who will pay based on the shorter period for the amnesty program.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, just one question. All the rest of them have been answered. On the parking tax collections, I know a few years ago when we looked into this issue in the Audits Committee, the estimate was as high as $23 million a year if we were able to fully implement all the programs to have better parking tax collection. I know we've gotten 11 million or so, which is actually pretty good, although probably not all of that is due to the collections. Probably some of it's the improved economy, too. The question is, the improvement that we're capturing in the budget of, I guess, $400,000, is that possibly a low-ball figure? Could we not be expecting that if we do an efficient job with the amount we're expending, that we would actually enjoy a higher return than $400,000?
Well, sir, as I mentioned, relative to the parking occupancy tax, the fact that we are looking at a $12 million increase in tax collections, taking into consideration 13-14, we're taking certainly the base amount of $8 million that's in 12-13, and that's being moved forward to 13-14. And part of that base includes, it's not just from the economy, it's from improved collections.
Sure.
So I think you have to take out part of that, when you're looking at the overall picture. Relative to the $400,000, that's based on the controller's audit, where they identified some things that we could do to improve collections for parking tax. And that is a rough estimate. Until we get the program in place, we don't know how much more is going to be collected there. Relative to the $23 million, what was not stated about that, it does include estimated assessments, which are high, estimated on the high end. So not all of that is money that the city would ultimately collect. So I think you have to take that in consideration as well.
So the bottom line is, you think that's an accurate number?
Yes,
or do you think there's not a possibility that we do better than that?
I think improving collections for parking tax from fiscal year 10-11 to 12-13 by 10% is huge. It is significant.
Certainly.
And of course, the incremental increase that we have for 13-14, I think it's about 3.5%.
Okay, so I guess you think at this point we have a little bit of diminishing returns because we've accomplished so much already.
Well, I think ultimately we will have some improvements with the parking tax collection bond, but we do need to get that in place. And once that is in place, I would expect to see certainly increases in parking tax revenue associated with that as well. But until we get that in place, I don't feel comfortable adding any additional monies at this point.
Okay, very good.
Mr. LaBonge?
I just wanted to make sure that you have all the tools that you need. You got a big job, and I know there's been a lot of discussion over the years, finance. Make sure you got the tools to recover the cost, and let us know if there's things that you do, technology or otherwise, that would help you be more efficient. I'm open. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Well, actually, along those lines, and well, let me go ahead and let you respond to that first. You were going to respond to Mr. LaBonge.
Yeah, I just wanted to certainly, thank Councilmember LaBonge and the council for providing us with the tools. We have been, and certainly the mayor's office as well, we have certainly implemented a number of technological changes which have resulted in increased revenues. The one thing that is in my budget letter to the Budget and Finance Committee is really looking at our salary savings rate, and I know that was not brought up by any of you guys. And so I just wanted to state that because our budget has been cut substantially in terms of staffing resources, we would not be able to sustain a 3% salary savings. And so what I would ask, which is similar to what the Controller's Office requested, we are projecting about $500,000 in salary savings for this fiscal year. We're asking that be reappropriated to cover the deficit that we would actually go into the year with a salary savings of 3%. And we believe that that's prudent, and we're asking for your support.
And I was going to actually ask you about that, and I'd like us to have a report back on that possibility, and part of that report should also indicate whether there are increased revenues that we could take into account in the budget that would result from that salary savings reduction as well, if we can.
I can speak to that, but of course we can do a report back as well.
I'm sure you can speak to it, but I think sure. I'd like it to be quantified in the report back, if we could. More broadly, much of the discussion over the last several years about the budget and our deficit, especially in the public's mind, has centered on collections efforts. And we now have an Inspector General in place who's made recommendations. We've had the core recommendations. We had the Macias study. We've had many controllers' audits. There's been a lot of attention paid to collections, and in fact there's a recommendation that the CAO be authorized to direct departments to work on enhancing collection efforts. I think I don't have the exact language, but that something along those lines in this budget. I'd like to get an overview from you, if I can, about what progress you feel have been made in collections generally, and whether there are particular departments that need more improvement in their collections effort that we should be focusing our attention on through the course of these budget proceedings.
Well, I certainly think that there has been improvement in the accounts receivable collections. As you will note, the large delinquent collections lies primarily with the Department of Transportation and the Fire Department. The Fire Department did proceed with utilizing an outside service to do their billing and collections. They are also referring delinquent accounts to the city's contracted collection agencies. So we've seen some improvements with the Fire Department in their collections of ambulance bills. And of course they have been able, for the most part, meet their revenue targets. On the transportation side, I know that the Department of Transportation, they did go out with an RFP for their parking citations collections. We provided information that we felt would be useful for them to include that ties into the mayor's directive on revenue collections. And so it is our hope and anticipation that we will see improvements on the parking tax citations, delinquent collections as well. Also, departments are referring accounts to the Board of Review for write-off. We had a large number of balances on the books for a long period of time, so we have seen a dramatic decrease in those accounts, or amounts rather, on the books, which we believe is prudent and should be done. So I think overall we have seen improvements. Certainly the Office of Finance is working collaboratively with the Inspector General on revenue collections. We are part of the Revenue Oversight Committee, and so we participate in those meetings, which generally are held monthly, but I think will be now quarterly. Relative to centralization, I know that is something that the Inspector General has recommended, and we will be working with him and his office on a report back.
Right. Very good. Okay. Anything further, members? Right. Thank you any responses from staff or questions from staff?
No, just that we also support the idea of centralizing collections as a means of professionalizing that function and bringing some level of continuity throughout the city.
Very good. Thank you very much. And that will bring us to Lacers. We may in fact be done. This is the last department. This is it. So, which I can't even believe. I can't believe that it's 5:30. We're going to be done.
We should have been done earlier.
Good afternoon, and it still is afternoon. We I think, are ahead of schedule. And members, just as a reminder, last year we completed every single session of this Budget Committee's meetings before 7 o'clock, at or before 7 p.m. I intend to do our very, very level best to keep to that record this year as well, and it looks like we're well ahead of schedule. So, welcome.
Thank you very much.
I don't have a letter, so if you'd like to go ahead and make a brief introductory comment, then we'll go straight to questions.
Absolutely. Tom Mautis, General Manager of Lacers. With me today are my Assistant General Managers Lita Payne and Lee C., and our Chief Investment Officer Rod June. I'm happy to report that unlike last year when we came before this committee and had basically a 0% return on our investment that fiscal year, to date, unaudited, we're at about 15% this year. So very good news if we can hold on to the majority of that.
Repeat that loud and clear.
We're unaudited at approximately 15% investment return this year. So if we can hang on to the vast majority of that, that'll be good news for the city and for our members.
So on the rate, obviously my big question is always rate of return assumptions. We've talked about that many times. Over the course of the last 25 years, say, or 30 years, what has been the annualized rate of return?
Over the last 25 years, it's been 8.2% gross of fees, and for 30 years, 10% gross of fees. And if we maintain the pace this year, we'll be doing quite well. And it is a long-run assumption, as you bring up. It is a 30 to 50-year assumption. So when you look at any individual year, we may or may not be close to that assumed return in any given year. But it is prudent, as you're pointing out, to look at it as a long-term assumption, as it is often 30 to 50 years.
And I think folks who read about this in the newspaper and they see that the stock market on a given year might be struggling, may not fully appreciate the fact that your investment horizon is much, much longer than the average person's. And so the ups and downs of the market are less impactful on a given budget year and the actuarial assumptions for that budget year because of the long-term nature of the investment. Now, you said gross returns. What would be the net returns after you take into account fees, or put another way, how much is Lacers spending in fees, and are there strategies that you might be able to adopt to reduce the amount of fees and thereby increase the gross return and thereby potentially relieve the city of some general fund pressures?
Our board, with the help of our consultants and staff, takes a look at that issue approximately every 3 years. We take a look at the asset allocation of the fund. We do our best to maximize the risk-adjusted returns of our fund. As part of that, we're looking at what investments it makes sense to do on a passive basis and therefore have lower fees, and what investments we think that we can get additional value from, even over the fees that we might pay on the active management. And so we're going through a process right now. The board completed its asset allocation last January, and we're going through right now and revamping our investments based on that asset allocation.
Great. So when will that be completed, and when might we be able to hear back about those changes?
Well, we can brief you on those changes. It's going to be completed over approximately the next year, when our searches will be completed on that. And we already realized approximately $10 million in savings by going to more passive strategies in some of our investment classes. I don't know that we'll realize much more savings than that, because there are some areas where we believe it is absolutely prudent to be in actively managed investments, and that is proven out over the long term.
I'd like to hear back, I'd like to get a report back on that about where we are with reducing fees and how that compares, how both our rate of return and our fee expenditures compares to CalSTRS, CalPERS, as well as major other municipal pension funds.
I can tell you I have some numbers from last year. We haven't updated them yet for this year. Compared to CalPERS, on a 22 years basis, we were at 8.93% average return. CalPERS was 8.95, so 2/100ths of a percentage point ahead of us, and CalSTRS was at 8.84, or significantly lower than we were on a 22-year average basis.
And that's the gross return, or is that net of fees?
That is also a gross return.
Okay, so if we could also get the information about fees, the fee comparison, that would be helpful as well. Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, a couple of questions. I know an issue that we probably explore every year is, at least in passing, is the consolidation of functions between the two pension systems, fire and police and LACERS. How much progress have we made on that? Are there other things that we could do that duplicate? I know particularly advisors have had relatively similar success, so whether we need a separate group of advisors, whether we've already reduced that and consolidated that.
The controller, mayor, and council are undergoing their 5-year management audit of both of the pension systems, fire and police, and LACERS, and I believe those results will be forthcoming in the near future. We already work very collaboratively with the other pension systems in the city to save where we can. The biggest item on that is an investment fees, and we aggregate the various investment contracts that we have when we have the same manager and same mandate, so that we pay fees based on the aggregate amount invested as opposed to our individual amount. There are some other cost-saving things that we do, but that's the major one.
So we're still looking at other possibilities in this management audit that you're talking about?
That is one of the issues that the management audit is exploring.
Very good. I know last year the mayor budgeted around $73 million for the retiree health plan, and this year $96 million for an increase of $23 million. That seems like a pretty significant increase. Why that large a number?
The investment contribution of the city is going up a total of about $30 million between the current fiscal year and the coming fiscal year. Approximately $20 million of that is based on the contribution rate increase adopted by our board and based on our actuarial valuation. And the other $10 million of that is based on an increase in salaries, which then necessitates an increase in the contribution because the contribution is based on the salaries.
So the increase in the retiree health plan?
The overall contribution to our plan, which incorporates both retiree health and the pension portion.
Okay, so that's mostly because of a change in how you calculate it?
No, it's mostly based on the investment losses from 2008, 2009 still working their way through the system, and also an increase in salaries on which the contribution is based. And so we did have a change in methodology from the projected unit credit to entry age normal. That is actually going to save or defer some money for the coming fiscal year. It's actually not costing the city anything to switch over to that methodology, and it provides the city with a much more stable and sustainable contribution pattern into the future.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rosendahl.
A few more questions that seem to make sense here. First, let me just start with too often our city employees are criticized by the public and some media outlets for not contributing enough to their pensions, with most of our civilian employees now contributing an additional 4% of their pay toward pensions. How much has this saved the city this year alone?
Well, 4% of contribution, the city doesn't get full credit for that because of a couple of actuarial issues, but they believe they get about 3.85% of that credit for that. And for each percentage saved, it's about $17 million.
Great. So, thank you. It has been said the city will save between $30 million to $70 million during the first 5 years of the new civilian pension tier. Roughly, how many new hires does this equate to?
I would defer to the CAO on that.
For this budget, we're assuming 200 new hires, and so the rate for Tier 2 is 18.32 above the salary, compared to, for those of us in Tier 1, 25.33%. So you're seeing a significant reduction in the overall rate towards pensions as a result of the new tier. Now, the savings increase as we hire new employees.
Right.
And so we're assuming about 200 under this budget.
Great. How much money does the city save in the LACER contribution by pre-funding the civilian pensions through the issuance of the TRAN? And when I asked that question about the issuance of the TRAN, somebody explained what we mean by TRAN for the general public to understand it. But the question again is, how much do we save by pre-funding the civilian pensions through the issuance of the TRAN? I'm sorry, sir?
Our calculations are around 15 million.
15 million.
Compared with the payment at end of each pay period.
Great.
Versus the payment in advance.
Great, thank you. My last question. Have we been seeing better returns in our investment portfolio since the recession? And I heard a percentage. I want to hear it one more time.
Right now, unaudited for this fiscal year, we're at 15%. And over 3 years, if 15% was to hold, we'd be over 12% on a 3-year period.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Englander, anything for Lacers? Is there any active consideration to any changes in the assumed rate of return or that we should know about for the coming fiscal year?
There is not at this time. The management audit may bring forth a recommendation on that, and we also have an actuarial audit active at this point that may bring forward a recommendation on that. I can tell you that based on a survey of 126 public pension funds that was conducted last month, the average rate of return assumption is 7.77%. We're at 7.75, so we're very close to the average.
Very good. Thank you very much. Any comments or questions from staff?
No, just I think it's important to thank the LACER system because we asked them when they reduced the rate of return that they allow us time to adjust to it, and and they agreed to do so, and that provided us some relief.
Very good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So that will bring up police and fire now. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Bill Raggio. I'm the interim general manager at Fire and Police Pensions. I'm joined today by Joe Salazar, one of our assistant general managers, Tom Lopez, our chief investment officer, and Stephanie Clements, chief management analyst over our administrative operations division. Just quickly, we too are experiencing significant returns to date. We're about 14% to date. And for next fiscal year's budget, we heard loud and clear some of the concerns from the mayor's office and from some of the council members that the investment fees were high. So in this budget, we reduced investment fees by about $11.6 million. And just this morning, we had an ad hoc committee meeting where we're looking at also reducing investment fees by looking at some of our alternative investment classes.
Very good.
Happy to answer any questions you have.
There's been an increase in the percentage of the contribution rate from a little under 40 to 44. As I say, can you talk about what the factors were that went into that increase, and also what steps the board is taking to try to mitigate the impact on the contribution?
Sure. Most of the increases are due to the losses that were experienced in 2007, 2008, working their way through the system. Recognizing the losses and how they were going to impact the city, we took action early on to go from 5-year to 7-year smoothing, which moderates the contribution increases for the city. We've also taken other steps which have resulted in deferrals for the city of $380 million over the last 4 years. And that includes phasing in some of the assumptions that the actuary had recommended to us. We also adopted a new amortization policy in September of 2012, which reduced the contribution for the city by about 1.5%. And in addition, we give credit to the city for the excess benefit plan, which is about $1 million.
Very good. And over the course of the last 25 years, what has been the actual gross return?
Over a 25-year period, we're about 8.31%, okay. Which, the way we track the numbers, in every reporting period, we beat CalPERS, except for the 25-year period. That's the only period that we did not beat CalPERS.
So that's the worst one, and you're still up that high. That's very good.
Correct.
All right. Mr. Rosendahl.
I'm just really happy to hear all the progress we've made, to be candid with you, when we hear such doomy, gloomy realities. It's nice for us to really lay it out and explain it. And I know the viewers out there get an appreciation of that, because it's informing and educating. These aren't easy issues or easy situations, so I appreciate it. New Tier 6. How much money has the city saved so far under the new Tier 6 sworn pension plan? And approximately, how many new police officers have been hired under this new tier?
I do not have the number on how much has been saved, nor do I have the number on how many officers. We do have the information on what the city budgeted for Tier 6. I would be happy to report back to you, working with the CAO's office on to provide that information.
Sure, and we've hired, this is now the second budget that includes Tier 6, and the city hires about 300 to 350 officers, so there's already been about that amount.
About 350?
Yes.
Okay, good. Does our city remain competitive with LA County and the state when it comes to the benefits offered through this new sworn pension tier?
I would say so. We're still at a 90% pension. The state made some changes that will probably look more attractive to sworn personnel. So after a 33-year career, they can retire with a 90% pension. That remained unchanged. What the city did was backload some of those increases to reach the 90%. They backloaded them so that they have to work longer to achieve the higher retirement level. And so that is expected to save the city money over the course of time.
Okay, what's the difference between the state and what they do and what we do, percentage-wise? I heard 35%, or am I imagining that? 30% over the years?
Joe, do you have that information?
We'll just leave that on the side, okay? We'll get back to you. On the average under-drop program, how many additional years are we able to retain police officers?
With the drop program?
Yeah.
5.
Yeah, they're eligible to remain in drop for 5 years, and it has demonstrated that folks are working longer. as a result of drop. Every 5 years, the city is supposed to take a look at drop to determine whether it's cost neutral. We're working with the CAO's office now to initiate that study, and our board approved the actuarial to take a look at that, and we expect to begin that study any day now.
Okay, great. And on the drop thing, how long can they stay in the drop program before they're no longer in it?
5 years.
5 years.
Correct.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. LaManche?
What do you hear from the field? Often the firefighters or police officers are quite vocal on issues. How are they feeling on your work?
On my board?
Yeah. Do you get complaints at all?
I think my understanding is that the rank and file wish that the city or the pension system would do a better job at putting the word out that these benefits are valuable to the members, that for public safety especially, it's important for them to have that security, the retirement security, the benefits for their spouses and their families.
Right.
There's obviously been a lot of criticism of the public defined benefit plans over the last several years, and I believe that folks just need to keep in mind that fire and police has been around since 1899. So we've experienced world wars, Great Depression, various market crashes, and we're still here. We're still over 80% funded, and the rule of thumb is that if you're 80% funded, you're in good shape financially as a pension system. So I think that they just want us to go a little more on the offensive, if you would, although we don't really see our role as going on the offensive rather than just providing facts and letting the policymakers do what they will with that information.
The life expectancy of a firefighter or a police officer, is there any difference to the basic population?
Yes. Joe, do you have that? They offset it by 3 years, I believe.
Past years, our last experience study that our actuary performed, we actually ended up changing our mortality assumptions to account for them living longer.
Right.
So, but they do, on average, die at a younger age than civilians.
Right. Okay. And I just wanted to ask on the other matter, too. None of these, or city employees for that matter, are on Social Security anyway. Does anyone get a letter from the Social Security Administration every year or every other year? I got one, and it had like 29, 30 years or more of zeros. This is the only one that you have. So I think that's another information just to articulate that this is self-invested, based a lot on the function of municipal government back 2 centuries ago almost, as you stated. So education is important as we communicate. I think to be fair is very important. I don't think we should live above the people who we serve, but at the same time, we have to make sure that our members who do serve live a good retirement after giving it all in the middle of the night, waking up, or working very difficult hours in a very challenging profession. So I thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Krebs, anything?
No, I think I asked all my questions for lasers. So.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. And Mr. Rosendahl, thank you for making the clarifications that you did, I think, because often there's an awful lot of public misperception about what happens in pension funds. And when people talk about an assumed rate of return as being above what they think it should be because they don't expect the market to do that well that year, so they're just completely comparing apples and oranges. And I think the long-term rate of return that we've seen, both from police and fire and from lasers, puts the lie to those silly assumptions that some out there in the public are raising about our pension funds. And Mr. Raggio, I just want to thank you and your staff for doing a terrific job and working to keep control of the costs and the pressures on the general fund and working cooperatively with us to do that. So thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. We do have one public comment card on pensions. That's Mr. Mcquiston. So, Mr. Mcquiston, 1 minute.
Jim Mcquiston. I do want to say one thing. We don't want to put a lot of emphasis on how do we cut down on the overhead, you might say, of trying to maximize income, because it sends really the wrong idea to the people who are maximizing this interest, that maybe they should just slack off and let the city go to pot. And we have to remember that if we had to do this ourselves, we wouldn't be getting this kind of rate of return. So we have to temper our trying to cut down on the overhead with the advisors. That's my only comment that I wanted to point out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mcquiston. Colleagues, it is 5:35. I want to congratulate the committee and all of the staff who've participated today in allowing us to finish our work expeditiously today. As I said, it's going to be our goal to finish every evening by 7. We have finished our work for the day, so this committee will be in recess until tomorrow at 1 p.m.
You're watching LA City View, Channel 35.
We now join our scheduled program in progress.
Stream from that little fingertip spring that we saw when we began our adventure. We're now to the place on the watershed where the fingers are coming together to form the hand and the wrist and a river.
All right, so we started with the little spring, which were the tips of the fingertips.
Right.
We're now down to, is this classified as a river?
This is the American River.
So this is part of the hand. We've gone from the fingertips down to the hand.
Right.
And that's the cue for, your name is?
Jim Branham.
Jim, you're standing right here by the river.
Beautiful place.
To talk with us, you're from the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and this is all part of your territory here. And why are you here to tell us about this particular part of the watershed, the hand part?
Right, Heel. Well, this is the part of the watershed where you really begin to get a feel for the interaction with people. Downstream, we have a plant that produces energy. We have recreation here. And we begin to see the important interaction in the watershed with humans who work here, who live here, who recreate here. The watersheds, this is the heart of the watershed, but there's a lot of things that go on in the watershed.
And you're really beginning to see a measurable amount of water right here, too. This is all kind of what has been flowing down the sides of the mountains, forming these rivers and these streams. And what is it that you're concerned about when it gets to this point?
Well, this is incredibly important to California. The Sierra Nevada region produces about 2/3 of the state's water. It starts as snowpack or rainfall. So managing these watersheds well to make sure we're taking care of the critters and the habitat, delivering good clean water and producing all of the products that come from that, and most importantly the water that is delivered into the urban centers, into our farms and ranches and factories and so on. So we're trying to assist water districts, our federal and state partners, local groups,
the Forest Service,
for example, with being just good stewards, helping them.
Because Jan was talking about, they're worried about, and they want to keep control over when they build roads, when they do mining, when they clear out the brush so there won't be these huge forest fires.
Right.
That's kind of what you're interested in as well.
Absolutely. And it's, again, trying to figure out how do we take what seem to be competing interests and really harmonize them so we can all figure out a way to be successful here, to avoid things like major fire, which have huge impacts on water quality, on air quality, and, of course, to our aesthetic values, and at the same time protect the habitat values and the natural resources.
You want to keep this water clean, and boy, this is clean water right here. This looks like it's pristine. So it's doing well, but you've got there's a box up here. This is why we're here, is to kind of talk about this box, and then there's a pipe that goes down here and a gauge that's down here. What's this all about?
Well, this looks great. This is clean water. This is wonderful, but it's a product of a lot of work. All the stuff that happens upstream that keeps sediment and other kinds of potential pollutants out of the water, and then projects like this, which measure flow, temperature, really understand what's going on in the river. Water agencies are doing that constantly. As we talked about earlier, we've found that everything in nature is connected, so understanding what's happening here really gives us the information we need to make decisions upstream and downstream. So
what do you mean make decisions? I mean, how do you make a decision? The water's flowing down out of the mountains into these rivers. What are you going to do about that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that happen in the watershed. You talked about roads. You talked about other activity that could change this from this beautiful, clear water to something less than that. And we want to make sure that we understand what's going on, and then to the extent that we have to make management decisions or go to find the source of the problem, are able to go do that.
So for example, if there were pollutants in here, you would try to trace that to some place up here, a new road that had been built, a new mine that had been put in, some kind of forest practices that were being implemented, to find out why it's making this polluted water.
Right, exactly. All this information feeds back to going back to the source if you have a problem, and we've learned a lot from that over the years, and there's a lot of good practices on the ground today that are the results of this kind of monitoring.
Now, this is interesting. If you didn't know better, you wouldn't know what this is, but this ties in directly with not only the watershed, but with the use of the water from the watershed. Let everybody know what this is, because I would never have guessed.
This is a Gold Rush vintage ditch system. This is part of the diversion that people took the water to serve their needs, primarily to take water to the gold mines, the hydraulic mines in this country.
So the miners in California, in Placer County, in 1849, 1850, 1851, dug this ditch to divert water to help them pan for gold, mine gold.
Mine gold, get the gold out of the earth. In fact, the Sierra Nevada had thousands of miles of this kind of infrastructure by 1860.
And this is what you're talking about when you talk about diversion of water to keep it all from going to the ocean, diversion of water for human needs.
It's a detour to serve a human need.
So when the miners, would this ditch have been just full and just flowing with water?
That's right. And you can see by its construction that there was a lot of leakage, too.
What do you mean? Oh, well, right up here on the
Well,
edge.
it's made out of stone, so water could move through it, too.
Wow. We were going to get down in the ditch for, to make a point, but you pointed out there's
poison oak
down there, so we're just going to stay up and observe history from the side of the ditch instead of down in the ditch. From that old earthen, made-by-hand ditch that was used by the miners over 150 years ago, we're still in Placer County, but now we've come to a new, modern water ditch here, Marie.
Well, Huel, this is the same vintage. This is 150 years old also. It's
this ditch right here.
That's right. It's just been maintained.
Well, it's got concrete sides on it, so it's been updated.
It's been maintained to preserve water and keep its integrity and still serve a lot of people.
Now, how does this water comes off rivers here in Placer County, just like the one we visited?
That's right.
So how is this water used today?
Today, this water goes to farms for agriculture. It goes to water treatment plants to go to homes.
Would this be drinking water eventually?
After it's treated, yes. After it goes to a water treatment plant and brought up to standards for today's California. And that's part of the intrigue of this, Gold Rush vintage infrastructure serving today's California.
This is amazing that this still exists here in California. Something this old and this historic has been updated and used for today's water needs.
There are 150 miles of this ditch still serving Placer County and 1,000 miles in the foothills of the Sierra.
This is amazing. And this water is all part of the watershed. It's coming off the rivers that came off the springs. So this is just another segment of the way the water is flowing down, getting ever closer to consumption and use by people.
This is part of the detour people have taken the water on, in the watershed, yes, to serve our needs.
Now look at this. This is, I got to tell you, you're just overwhelmed with history here to think that this ditch, and it goes all the way down here, was used by the miners back in 1850, and it's still here. But wait, it gets even better, because from this old historic water ditch, the water is coming into this old historic water flume. And you tell me that here in Placer County, and actually all over this part of California, and boy, look at this. This just really captivates you when you see it looking down one of these flumes. There's a lot of water, and it's moving.
It's moving, and it carries the water across gaps in the topography. The ditches are designed to carry water at equal elevation, and these are essentially bridges across little canyons to keep the water moving.
And how much flume is there in this part of Northern California? Because it's all over up here still, isn't it?
Scores of miles. The original system is 150 years old, but we're constantly repairing it, making it stronger, keeping it up.
Because they wouldn't have had it made of this kind of, what would the flumes have been made out of originally?
They were originally wood bottom, but it wasn't long after they were built that they were made out of tin, flume tin.
Wow. And this goes all the way down.
It goes across this little gully, keeping the water at equal elevation, and rejoining the ditch system on the other side of this little swale.
Wow. You know, I don't think, well, most people, because flumes are really in very out-of-the-way places, aren't they? I mean, most of us don't have an opportunity to see a flume like this, do we?
No, you have to come back in the backcountry, like you've been today.
It goes all the way up and through here. And the miners would have built all of this as well.
That's right, that's right. They were bringing water down to get the gold out of the earth, and this was one of the ways to do it. They needed the energy and the elevation of the water.
Well, there's still a lot of energy, and again, just like with the ditches, this water is being used by Californians today.
Yes. This water goes to treatment plants, it goes to homes, it goes to agriculture. It's still being used today. This infrastructure is very elegant in its simplicity.
Now, Jim, this water is clean, but I guarantee you, back in the gold rush days, when the miners were digging these ditches and building these flumes, they didn't care about the quality of the water, did they?
No, they didn't, Huel. They had a different purpose, but as as California began to develop, it became a different issue.
Now, what do you mean, a different issue?
Well, as folks began to use it for agricultural purposes, for domestic purposes, and so on, there was a much greater concern about the quality of the water, quantity and quality, and the attitudes began to change, particularly at the ends of the watershed where people were using the water.
So all of this started changing once the gold rush was over. We started really caring about the quality of the water and how it was used.
Right, that's right. As the gold rush began to become a thing of the past to some extent, and people were using it, as I said, for agriculture and other purposes, a much different attitude about the water and the quality of the water.
And the point is is that water in California today, in these ditches and in these flumes and in these streams and in these rivers, the whole purpose is to try to keep this as clean and usable as possible, right?
That's correct. Having clean water coming out of the watershed is very important. The water provides a lot of other great benefits for species, for critters, for energy, and so on. But coming out with good, clean water for our purposes is a high priority.
Well, this water came from the little stream, the little spring. Do you think this, I mean, this is where all this water comes from?
That's right. We're moving down the arm.
Yeah, we're moving down the arm, and here it is. It's still clean.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. We're quite a ways from, even from the river, and it is clean water. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of things that happen from where it starts to here to make sure that it remains clean.
Yeah.
A lot of decisions get made. A lot of activities occur.
How clean is water in California?
Well, California's got its fair share of challenges, obviously. We've got the toughest standards in the nation, and we've made a tremendous amount of progress. The water out of the Sierra is remarkably clean, and when you think about some of the urban uses and some of the challenges you face with runoff and other things, this water is really, really very clean, and California's doing well.
We're cutting edge, aren't we?
Oh, we are. Yeah, like on many things in California, we're cutting edge, and there's a lot, as I say, a lot that's went into making sure that we can look down here and see the bottom of the flume clearly.
But isn't it interesting that even though California today is still cutting edge, we're still using the same ditches and the same flumes that have been here since Gold Rush days.
Yeah, and that really is a remarkable part of this story, is that, as you can see, we're using things that were put in 115 more years ago and using them quite effectively. And that's the other part of our great California ingenuity, I guess. But water districts and others have made it work.
Okay, our watershed adventure continues, and now this gets really exciting. We've got some rafting going on here, and Nate, explain to everybody exactly where we are and what's going on here.
We are on the Middle Fork of the American River, and we're right at the base of Oxbow Powerhouse. This is a powerhouse that's getting water that's been already through 4